Chapter 371. As the deadline given by Capone got closer and closer, the atmosphere in Alfalfa City became more and more solemn. What made the people in the city even more frightened was that Orlando did not yield in the face of Capone's ultimatum. Instead, he chose to resist. Perhaps in the eyes of outsiders, Alfalfa City was always in chaos and danger. But in fact, in the eyes of the locals, the chaos here was also orderly. Capone and the Brotherhood of Alfalfa City under his control were leading this kind of order. But now, this order was about to be broken. The various forces in the city began to become restless, both for the priceless bonds and for the authority of the city. Capone's deadline finally arrived under the expectant gazes of many people. On this day, the sun rose as usual. However, there wasn't much human activity in this notorious chaos city. On the empty streets, gusts of wind were sweeping up gusts of wind. In the houses on both sides of the street, pairs of eyes that were mixed with fear and excitement were observing everything outside through the gaps in the windows. Near noon, on several dilapidated main roads of Alfalfa City, in front of the Radiance Church, and in the central plazas of the three districts, groups of figures holding swords and clubs appeared almost simultaneously. As time passed, more and more people gathered. In the afternoon, there were a total of tens of thousands of people gathered at the major traffic points of Alfalfa City. They were divided into two distinct groups, facing each other in silence. No one knew who was the first to make a move, but the two torrents suddenly collided with each other. The members of the Brotherhood of Alfalfa laughed sinisterly as they stabbed the swords in their hands into the chests of their brothers. Between the flashes of the swords, fresh blood slowly spread along the carvings on the bluestone road. It was like a huge and mysterious magic formation, full of a mysterious and tragic aura. At this moment, life was fragile and worthless. Alfalfa City was like a huge mill of flesh and blood, constantly devouring one fresh life after another. The eyes of the two groups of people were bloodshot. They did not have fancy martial arts techniques or high-level fighting auras. They only had the most ferocious momentum and the most primitive brutality. This brutality was completely rooted in the bloodline of the living creatures, the killing instinct and bloodthirsty nature of the inheritors from ancient times. One by one, they were cut down, pierced through, and fell to the ground, twitching and howling. Then, they were trampled under the feet of those who came later. All of their dignity, face, and identity seemed so pale and powerless in the face of slaughter. It didn't matter if they were the leaders of Alfalfa City's reputable gangs, the awe-inspiring gold medal fighters, or even the underlings at the bottom of the chain of contempt. At this moment, everyone had obtained absolute fairness. Everyone only had one life. At this time, the fighting taking place in the streets and alleys of Alfalfa City was far from a real confrontation between two armies. There was no neat military formation, no uniform, and no iron-blooded discipline. However, the danger and desperation involved were not inferior in the slightest. These people did not have the organization and cooperation of a regular army, but they were just as ruthless and had the same disregard for life. In terms of tenacity, they were even better. When a small team was scattered by their opponents, they immediately fled in all directions, hiding in the corners of the streets and alleys. When the time was right, they would regroup and attack again. The smell of blood became the strongest smell in the city, and the sound of fighting became the only main sound in this part of the world. The whole city seemed to have become a huge coliseum, crowded with wild beasts killing each other for glory, benefits, and survival. It wasn't until nightfall that the fierce fighting came to an end. The miserable howls and roars gradually subsided. Some people were lying on the ground, and of course, there were also people who stood upright while stepping on the corpses. However, the war had just begun, and it was only the intermission now. Victory and defeat were still far from being decided. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, Orlando looked at Alfalfa City that was gradually being swallowed by darkness with a calm expression. The underling standing behind him was constantly looking up and sizing up his boss's back. He wanted to say something several times, but he hesitated. After a long while, Orlando's cold voice finally came. "Tell them that there is no pension." But, boss, they said that if there is no pension, they will. I said, there is no pension. Orlando suddenly turned around, his eyes wide open as if he wanted to eat his underling. Since they have chosen to fight with me against Capone, then don't think about backing down halfway. You go and tell them that when we achieve the final victory, I will give them what they deserve, not a single copper coin less. But now that victory and defeat have not been decided, they can forget about taking anything from me. Yes. The underling didn't dare to say anything more, and hurriedly retreated. Orlando stared at the dark night sky alone for a while, then turned around and walked downstairs. But just as he turned a corner, he stopped. Because in front of him stood the person he didn't want to see the most, Capone. Orlando only felt his whole body stiffen. He wanted to run away, but he didn't dare to make any movements. Capone stood quietly in the same place and didn't make any further movements. The ridicule in his eyes was like a fierce tiger observing the struggle before its prey died. Orlando opened his mouth and said bitterly, "There are only 3 people who know that I am here. Which one betrayed me?" Capone smiled proudly and said, "Guess?" At this moment, Orlando still maintained the most basic calmness. After thinking for a moment, he said, "It should be Rice. In today's battle, his subordinates suffered the most casualties, and he is also the one who wants me to take out a portion of the bonds to pay the compensation." Clap, clap. Capone actually applauded and praised from the bottom of his heart. Amazing! However, Orlando, if you had taken out a portion of the bonds to buy people's hearts earlier, you wouldn't have ended up like this. Orlando pursed his lips and didn't say anything. Capone smiled and continued, "Of course, if you give me all those bonds now, I can still let you live." Orlando still didn't say anything. The smile on Capone's face gradually disappeared, and his tone became cold. Since you don't know what's good for you, then don't blame me for being impolite." Before he finished speaking, Capone was like a strong rhinoceros, charging towards Orlando with an unstoppable momentum. Orlando's face immediately turned pale, and he instinctively rolled forward. Boom! The stone ground exploded with a loud bang, and a large amount of gravel sputtered out like bullets. Many of them hit Orlando's body, smashing bruises. Orlando didn't dare to think too much. He got up from the ground in a sorry state and ran away. As a rank 5 warrior, Capone's personal strength was at the top of the pyramid in Alfalfa City. How could Orlando dare to confront him head-on? However, Capone laughed sinisterly, and a look of ridicule appeared in his eyes. He once again chased after him. Hearing the wind behind him, Orlando didn't have time to think about it. He stabbed with the longsword in his hand. Clang! The longsword was casually slapped by Capone, and the entire blade cracked, shooting out a large amount of fragments. Orlando himself was also sent flying by the huge force transmitted from the longsword, and he crashed into the wall on the side. Orlando spat out a mouthful of blood, and sat paralyzed on the ground, despair appearing in his eyes. Calm and unruffled, Capone slowly approached Orlando and mocked, "Orlando, you still have one last chance. Hand over the bonds, and I'll give you a way out." Orlando gasped a few times, but suddenly laughed. Capone narrowed his eyes in confusion. Just as he was about to ask if the other party was crazy, he suddenly felt a cold gaze coming from behind him. He quickly turned his head and saw a man covered in white armor. He didn't know when he had appeared behind him. Chapter 372. "Who are you?" Capone asked in a deep voice with a solemn expression. "I am here to kill you." The armored man's way of speaking was a bit strange, as if he hadn't spoken for a long time. It was difficult and slow, but the killing intent contained in his words was so substantial that it couldn't be ignored. Capone felt as if he was facing a formidable enemy. Although the other party hadn't made a move yet and he couldn't figure out his background, Capone knew that the armored man's strength wasn't below his own, just from the fact that he could appear behind him without a sound. When did such a master appear in Alfalfa City? "How did I offend your excellency to make you want to kill me?" Capone asked tentatively. At the same time, he saw Orlando, who had fallen into despair, with a gloating smile on his face. This smile made Capone's heart thump. He realized that he had been fooled. Orlando was the bait. The armored man didn't answer Capone's question, perhaps because he was too lazy to explain. He slowly pulled out the long sword at his waist, and the sonorous sound of unsheathing broke the last trace of hope in Capone's heart. The long sword swung out. In an instant, countless images poured into Capone's mind. He seemed to see magma flowing, volcanoes erupting, and cliffs breaking and falling. Huge rocks crashed to the ground, and flames and meteors burst out in all directions. Ah! Capone roared and suddenly broke free from the illusion. When he opened his eyes again, he was shocked to find that the tip of the armored man's sword was about to touch his forehead. Boom! At the critical moment, Capone only had time to raise his sword and swing it up. A huge explosion shook the ground, and the broadsword in Capone's hand shattered inch by inch like glass. Countless fragments fell to the ground, making a sizzling sound. There was also a wisp of smoke, as if it had just been thrown into a hot furnace to forge. The terrifying impact knocked Capone away, and he knelt on the ground. The armored man slowly approached, his cold eyes filled with a bone-chilling murderous intent. "It's over," Orlando said gloatingly, a trace of relief flashing in his eyes. But at this moment, Capone's lowered head suddenly raised. His arms were crossed in front of him in an instant, and he roared, "I want you to die." Clang, clang. As Capone waved his hands, streaks of cold black light streaked across his body like scissors. The two figures crossed each other and retreated once again. The armored man didn't seem to realize that Capone's attack had suddenly become so strange. Two deep cracks immediately appeared on his chest armor. Capone stood in front of the armored man, bent his knees and bent his waist. Two daggers glowing with a faint blue light appeared in his hands. A sinister and crazy smile appeared on his face. He roared in a strange tone, "Don't worry, brat, I'm going to rip open your chest, cut open your skull, peel off your skin, and bring all your organs back for my collection." The armored man stared at Capone and spoke again in a stiff tone. "Are also grade 6. Capone smiled smugly and said, "That's right. I've been hiding my strength for many years. I didn't expect that it was actually forced out by you. Kid, who the hell are you?" As a 6th Order warrior, it's impossible for him to be nameless. Indeed, although a 6th Order warrior wasn't as rare as a Sanctuary-level warrior, he was definitely a big shot. In the entire Radiance Empire, there were only a handful of them. The armored man still didn't reveal his identity. He just looked at Capone with indifferent eyes, as if the other party's hidden strength didn't worry him too much. It was just that this indifference was seen by Capone as a disregard for himself, which also deeply hurt his proud heart. Hiding your head but showing your tail? Go to hell. Capone didn't hesitate to activate his strongest state. A faint blue light suddenly burst out from his hands, spreading upward like flowing water, and condensing into a strange symbol in the middle of his chest. In an instant, his speed suddenly increased by a large margin. His whole body suddenly turned into a blue shadow and rushed toward the armored man. The armored man didn't dodge, and his posture was still indifferent. He just held his sword with both hands and raised it high. The long sword suddenly twisted, drawing a semicircular arc in the air. In the blink of an eye, countless thin lines condensed from fighting energy fell from the sky like dense arrows, madly shooting toward Capone's position. Capone's eyes narrowed, but he didn't dodge at all. His eyes lit up with a dazzling blue light, and in an instant, it was as if everything in the world had stopped at the same time. Boom! The two men collided without any fancy moves, and a circle of invisible ripples suddenly burst out, like ripples spreading in all directions. Orlando looked at the two men in the battle with a horrified expression, completely dispelling the original idea of going up to help. He could only keep retreating, for fear of being affected by the aftermath of the battle. Clang, clang. The two men were evenly matched, and in an instant, they exchanged countless blows. After separating again, Capone suddenly laughed and said, "Lucian of the Northern Frontier, so it's you." Obviously, after this exchange, Capone recognized the armored man's true identity. However, the armored man didn't have any reaction to this, neither admitting nor denying it. On the side, Orlando's heart trembled slightly. Of course, he had heard of Lucian's name. He knew that this level 6 warrior of the Northern Frontier had married Countess Schultz, and that countless warriors were envious of him. However, a month ago he was suddenly exposed for plotting to kill Bishop John of Swan City. Since then, his reputation had been tarnished, and even Countess Schultz had drawn a clear line with him. He didn't expect that he would actually appear in Alfalfa City, and, just as Orlando's imagination was running wild, Lucien and Capone were once again entangled in battle. Perhaps it was because his identity had been exposed, Lucien's attacks became fiercer and fiercer. He even had a crazy momentum of fighting with his life. Pucci. Capone grabbed the long sword that pierced his right shoulder, and with a grim smile, he stabbed a dagger into Lucien's left chest. At the same time, he licked his lips, his eyes cold and manic as he growled, "You want to fight with your life on the line? Pa, I've experienced countless battles in my life, and the last thing I'm afraid of is fighting with my life on the line." Lucien didn't say a word, nor did he take half a step back. His right hand sank, and the long sword slashed down along Capone's shoulder. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of bones breaking could be heard. Capone didn't budge an inch, and the madness on his face became more intense. The dagger in his hand twisted rapidly, stirring up Lucien's chest like an electric drill. The two peak warriors were no different from desperate beasts that had met on a narrow path. All skills, strategies, and glory were thrown to the back of their minds. There was only one last thought left: to kill each other. The gurgling blood kept dripping, blooming into a demonic flower of blood on the devastated ground. A tragic aura circulated in the air, as if the Grim Reaper had quietly arrived, quietly waiting for the moment to wave his scythe. Capone stared at the armored man's eyes, trying to find a trace of hesitation and retreat in them. A warrior like him, who had climbed up step by step from the bottom, had long been accustomed to this feeling of wandering on the edge of life and death. He also knew very well that in this process of constantly falling into the bottomless abyss, whoever retreated first would lose. Capone had gambled with his opponent countless times, and every time, he was the winner. Therefore, this time he still firmly believed that he would win. Gradually, Capone's body began to shake, and the excessive blood loss made his brain start to lack oxygen. In a trance, he seemed to smell the breath of death. But Capone still didn't retreat. He knew that as long as he could hold on for a while, his opponent would definitely collapse. It had always been like this in the past. This time, it would be no exception. However, as time went by, Capone's confidence was rapidly fading. This was because he was shocked to find that the armored man opposite him was even more determined than him. Moreover, the armored man's strength didn't weaken in the slightest, and his body didn't tremble at all. It was as if what he had stabbed into the armored man's chest wasn't a fatal dagger, but a negligible needle. However, at this moment, even if Capone wanted to retreat, it was impossible. There was no turning back in the process of falling into the cliff of death. The Grim Reaper waiting at the bottom of the valley must harvest a soul. But aren't you afraid? Capone asked weakly. The armored man opposite him didn't answer, but the ridicule in his eyes was so strong that it was about to overflow. Bang! Finally, Capone was completely exhausted and knelt in front of the armored man. Chapter 373. Honorable Master Lucien, thank you for your help. Orlando carefully stepped forward and respectfully saluted the armored man. Although his heart was also filled with doubts, such as how did Lucien become Count Angeli's subordinate? And why did this person still have a calm and indifferent look on his face even though there was a big bloody hole in his chest? However, one thing was very clear. His life was saved by the person in front of him. Moreover, Orlando, who had been forced to a dead end, had once again seen the hope of survival. Perhaps, it could even go one step further. Colin looked at Orlando through the eyes of the blood slave Lucien, and his heart was filled with emotions. The chaos in Alfalfa City this time was indeed planned by Colin, but the development of the matter was beyond his expectations. It had to be said that the subjective initiative of a person was a wonderful thing. Every individual in the midst of chaos was struggling for their own interests, their own hatred, and their own fate. Harry, Blue, Ron, Capone, Orlando, in Colin's eyes, these people were originally small characters, chess pieces, but they might not be willing to follow the path that Colin had planned for them. These were the variables. This was also the reason why the more complicated the conspiracy, the harder it was to succeed. A simple and crude method would rarely lead to unplanned situations. However, to be simple and crude, one must have the strength to break through the situation. This, at least in Alfalfa City, was something that Colin could not do at the moment. Therefore, he had planned all of this. Although there were many accidents, fortunately, the final result was still satisfactory. Moreover, Colin had also received a pleasant surprise: Orlando. This thief leader of Alfalfa City might be of low birth, or perhaps he had an unbearable past, or perhaps even his character was questionable, but this time, he really made Colin have a whole new level of respect for him. Calmness in the face of a desperate situation, the wisdom to see through the puzzle, the courage to survive in the face of death, the courage to use himself as bait. If they were in each other's shoes, Colin knew that he might not be able to do better than him. This was a talent. If used properly, it might be able to help Colin secretly control Alfalfa City and even cause great trouble for the eastern region. It was a pity that Orlando was not a knight. Otherwise, Colin would have turned him into a blood descendant. It would be too much of a waste to turn them into blood thralls, Sir Lucian. Orlando looked at the silent armored man and could not help but feel a little uneasy. He reminded him, "Your injury, it's just a minor injury. It's fine." Under Colin's control, Lucian waved his hands casually and touched the broken armor to cover the unsightly wound. Orlando's lips twitched, but he did not dare to say anything. He changed the topic and said, "Master Lucian, may I pay a visit to Count Angeli and express my gratitude in person? The Count can't see you yet." Colin flatly refused. Seeing the disappointment on Orlando's face, he continued, "However, the Earl knows about you and is very satisfied with you." Orlando regained his hope and hurriedly said, "Thank you for your recognition, Count. Please tell the Earl that I am willing to swear allegiance to him. No matter what the Earl orders, I will do my best to accomplish it. I will convey your sincerity to the Earl, but under the current circumstances, you cannot be exposed." Orlando rolled his eyes and seemed to understand something. He immediately nodded and said, "Yes. What does the Earl have in mind for me?" The armored man's deep eyes showed no joy or anger, and his tone was very stiff. "The Earl said that since you can guess his plan and break free from this puzzle, it means that you are a smart person. Therefore, the Earl is willing to give you a chance to prove yourself. Without Capone, the Alfalfa Brotherhood will need a new leader, and you have great hope for that position right now. In a while, you will go to 87 Farron Street, where the Earl has left you a gift. At the same time, this is the greatest help the Earl can give you. As for whether you can control the underground forces of Alfalfa City, it will depend on your own ability. Thank you for your trust, Count. I will not let him down," Orlando said loudly. He had already vaguely guessed what the gift Count Angeli had left for him was. Moreover, he also knew that it could be a gift, but it could also be a rope that would take his life. However, Orlando did not hesitate to accept this gift. This near-death experience made him understand a lot of things. A small character like him, who had no influence or strength, might have a smart brain, but it was impossible to survive in such a chaotic world with just this. He had to have someone to rely on. Moreover, Orlando was also very clear that he did not have the right to refuse. Count Angeli had sent people to save him, but he could also send people to destroy him. Therefore, Orlando had to follow the script that Count Angeli had set for him and give the drama of Alfalfa City a perfect ending. Orlando raised his head and asked again, "Lord Lucian, I wonder if the Count has a detailed plan?" The armored man shook his head and said, "No, the rest is up to you." Orlando was a little worried, but more than that, he was eager to give it a try. The armored man saw the ambition of this small person, but he did not say anything more. Instead, he turned around and carried Capone, who had fainted on the ground and was on the verge of death, and disappeared into the dark night in a few flashes. Orlando stared at the place where the armored man had disappeared for a long time, then turned around and went downstairs. A group of loyal subordinates had already gathered downstairs, and after seeing Orlando, they immediately surrounded him. They had received orders before that no matter what happened upstairs, they were not allowed to come up, so after hearing the sounds of fighting, they were burning with anxiety. It was not until now that they saw Orlando appear again safe and sound that they finally felt relieved. "Boss, we found out that it was Musos who leaked your whereabouts to Capone." Orlando nodded, as if he was not surprised by this news, and did not give any orders, as if this guy who leaked the secret was not worth his attention. The subordinates looked at each other as they watched Orlando walk out without saying a word, and they had no choice but to quickly follow him. Under the cover of the night, Orlando successfully arrived at the address that the armored man had told him, and then found the gift that Earl Angeli had left for him in the abandoned warehouse. Yes, it was the priceless bond. Looking at this thing that had turned Alfalfa City upside down, Orlando could not help but sigh. But soon he put away these meaningless emotions, hid the bond close to his body, and walked out. Outside the warehouse, the subordinates kept reporting that the leaders of the major forces in Alfalfa City wanted to see Orlando. But Orlando snorted coldly and did not agree. Instead, he asked, "Did you find out the details of the messenger of the Eastern region that I asked you to investigate?" "Yes, the one who came to see Capone this time is Viscount Fine of the Eastern region." "Where is he now?" "In the cathedral in the Eastern City District." Orlando nodded, took a deep breath, touched the place where the bond was hidden at his waist, and said, "Well, let's go see this Viscounts of the Eastern region." Chapter 374. If it were in other cities, this would be the day of worship. However, in Alfalfa City, a city without faith, the Church of Holy Light located in the Eastern District was particularly deserted. This dilapidated cathedral had been through hundreds of years of wind and rain, and had been abandoned several times. The priests did not get the respect they deserved in this city, and they would even be treated as fat sheep to be slaughtered by the villains here. Over time, they were unwilling to come. However, recently, a young bishop from the Eastern region had come here, trying to bring the grace of the God of Light to this city, which was known as the most depraved city in the entire continent. Of course, this bishop did not really have the courage to sacrifice himself to feed the tiger, but because the city had gradually been controlled by the Alfalfa Brotherhood, it was also controlled by the Eastern region in disguise. If he came here to preach, he would not be threatened. However, it seemed that it would still take a certain amount of time to make all the villains in this city become devout believers of the God of Light. In the empty prayer hall, only a single-digit number of people were worshipping. The young man in gorgeous clothes was the Viscount Fine, who had been sent by the Eastern region to Alfalfa City to secretly hand over the bonds with the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce. This person was handsome and had an extraordinary temperament. There was an unconcealable arrogance between his eyebrows. This was also a common characteristic of every young person who was in a high position. After the service, the Viscount Fine chatted with the bishop for a while, and then left the prayer hall. Passing through the corridor alone, the Viscount Fine came to the garden behind the church. "I'm sorry, Mr. Arnold. I've kept you waiting." "Lord Viscounts, you're too polite. I came at a bad time and disturbed your service." The president of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce respectfully welcomed the Viscount Fine into the pavilion and personally poured him a cup of coffee. The Viscount Fine sat down at the table, took a sip of coffee, and then said straightforwardly, "Mr. Arnold, I'm very disappointed in this matter." Arnold suddenly said with a bitter face, "Lord Viscounts, you really can't blame me for this. Wasn't it stolen by the Alfalfa Brotherhood? When the Earl of Avon chose Alfalfa City as the trading location, he promised that my caravan would never encounter any danger here, but, Mr. Arnold, you clearly arrived earlier than the agreed time. We aren't ready yet." Viscount Fines interrupted with an awkward look on his face. "Lord Viscounts, I was worried that something might happen along the way, so I deliberately set off early. Who would have thought that something like this would happen in Alfalfa City?" Viscount Fines opened his mouth, but he could not say anything more. He knew that strictly speaking, this matter was indeed the Eastern region's problem, but the members of the Alfalfa Brotherhood were simply too difficult to control. "Mr. Arnold, you shouldn't have let two little thieves steal such an important item, right? Are the guards of your caravan just for show?" Viscount Fines questioned again. He was still unwilling to bear the responsibility for the theft of the bonds alone. Arnold shook his head and said, Lord Viscounts, you may not know this, but there were more than 2 thieves who visited our caravan that night. Arnold's eyes flashed, and he said seriously, I don't know the true identity of the other party, but there was indeed a group of powerful experts who sneaked into our caravan that night. At that time, the caravan's guards were all dealing with these people, so the 2 thieves took advantage of the loophole. Viscount Fines frowned. Obviously, he did not expect there to be such a hidden story. Seeing this, Arnold suggested again, Lord Viscounts, you can ask Lord Capone. After all, he has a deeper control of the underground forces of Alfalfa City. Perhaps he knows what happened that night. Capone. Viscount Fines frowned even more because there had been no news of Capone since he left alone last night. He did not know where the other party was or what he was doing. At this moment, a thought suddenly appeared in Viscount Fines' mind. Could it be that Capone had sent people on the night of the bond theft? Could it be that he had been fooled? Arnold saw that Viscount Fines was silent and his expression kept changing. He knew that his hint had successfully affected the other party, so he did not say anything else. A lie did not have to be complete and detailed. Sometimes, it was easier to let the other party's imagination fill in the truth. After a long time, Viscount Fines said, Mr. Arnold, you don't have to worry about the bond. I'll help you get it back. You can go back and wait for the news. After Arnold left, Viscount Fines felt that there was something wrong with Capone, so he found an attendant to ask for news of Capone. However, to his disappointment, there was still no news of Capone. At this time, Viscount Fines could not help but let his imagination run wild. Could it be that Capone had run away with the money? Not long after, the attendant came to report again, Sir, Mr. Orlando is outside asking for an audience. Orlando? Viscount Fines frowned, then nodded and said, Bring him to see me. Soon, Orlando walked into the church alone under the lead of the attendant and saw Viscount Fines. As soon as he saw Orlando, Viscount Fines snorted coldly and said angrily, Orlando, you actually dare to come to see me. Orlando bowed unhurriedly and then said, Viscounts, I know that you may have some misunderstandings about me, but there are some important things that I have to hand over to you personally. Viscount Fines raised his eyebrows and asked, What important things? Orlando immediately took a few steps forward and took out the bonds hidden in his clothes, placing them in front of Viscount Fines. Viscount Fines' expression changed, and he hurriedly went forward to check. After confirming the authenticity and number of the bonds, he asked in a deep voice, Orlando, since these bonds are really in your hands, why didn't you take the initiative to hand them over? Viscounts, because I know the importance of these things, I don't want them to fall into the hands of people with evil intentions. What do you mean? Orlando took a deep breath and said with a pained expression, Sir, don't you understand? All of this is a show directed and acted by Capone. He just wants to take all of these bonds for himself. What? Viscount Fines cried out in shock. Arnold's report just now had already made Viscount Fines begin to suspect Capone, and now Orlando was added. Viscount Fines' mind raced, but he still asked in a deep voice, Do you have any evidence for what you said? Orlando nodded and said confidently, Sir, in the beginning, my subordinates didn't know about the existence of these bonds at all. Not only them, but even I didn't know about it. Back then, my subordinates went to the caravan to make a small fortune. Who knew that they would bump into a group of people fighting with the caravan guards? In the chaos, they accidentally stole the bonds. However, the 2 of them didn't have much knowledge and didn't know what it was, so they handed it to me. I knew that this matter was of great importance, so I didn't explain it to them. Therefore, when Capone interrogated them with torture, they didn't know that what they had taken was what Capone wanted. It wasn't until Blue couldn't bear the punishment and randomly accused me that Capone suspected that the bonds were in my hands. Of course, I wouldn't give the bonds to Capone. Viscount Fines didn't know much about the specific situation of the interrogation, so he didn't doubt Orlando's story. It wasn't until he heard the end that he asked, Why didn't you give the bonds to Capone? Because I suspected that the group of people who sneaked into the caravan were Capone's subordinates. Before you came, Capone restrained the people of the Alfalfa Brotherhood and warned us not to attack the passing caravan. That's why we didn't dare to attack the North Wind Chamber of Commerce. Harry and Blue only dared to steal. And other than himself, who else would dare to ignore Capone's warning at this time? Viscount Fine's eyes flashed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Seeing this, Orlando continued to explain, "Sir, last night, Capone came to me again and said that as long as I handed over the bonds, he could share them with me. Are you sure?" Viscount Fine's eyes widened as he asked. "Of course." Orlando straightened his chest and said without fear, "If you don't believe me, you can find Capone. I dare to confront him face to face." Viscount Fine's narrowed his eyes and carefully sized up Orlando. The other party looked back without fear, his gaze honest. Such a posture greatly reduced Viscount Fine's suspicion of Orlando. He was silent for a moment before he asked again, "What happened last night?" "When I heard Capone say that, I immediately confirmed my previous suspicions, so I wouldn't hand over the bonds to him. I pretended to say that I was going to get the bonds, but in fact, I took the opportunity to escape. After daybreak, I took the initiative to look for you. I hope that you can uphold justice for me." Viscount Fiennes pondered for a long time before he said to Orlando, "All right, I will verify what you said. However, since you took the initiative to hand over these bonds, I will definitely report this credit to the Earl of Avon." "Thank you, Lord Viscounts." Orlando bowed and said. He wasn't afraid that Viscount Fiennes would verify it because Capone had already disappeared. This was enough to prove that the other party was guilty. And after Capone disappeared, there would definitely be someone to fill his vacancy. As for this candidate, Orlando lowered his head respectfully and revealed a smug smile. Chapter 375. Silvermoon City. In the basement of Half-Elven Palace, Colin looked at Capone kneeling in front of him, his eyes flashing with satisfaction. As a result, his Blood Shadow Guards now had a second 6th-rank blood slave, which was something worth celebrating. To be honest, he did have the idea of fighting Capone back then, otherwise he wouldn't have sent blood slave Lucien out of Alfalfa City to get a 5th-rank blood slave. But he didn't expect that Capone was actually hiding his strength. Unfortunately, due to his overconfidence, Capone had stepped into the trap that Orlando had set for him alone. Furthermore, he had chosen the stupidest way to deal with Lucien. Otherwise, Lucien would not have been able to defeat Capone alone, but he was not confident that he would be able to defeat Capone. Colin stared at Capone for a long time and suddenly felt that this person might be an important chess piece that the Eastern region had placed in Alfalfa City. After all, a 6th-rank warrior wasn't a cabbage. Even the Duke of St. Prospero couldn't underestimate such a person. After all, the Eastern region didn't have any sanctuary experts. 6th rank was the peak. It seemed that Alfalfa City really played an extremely important role in the Eastern region's plan. Otherwise, Capone wouldn't have hidden his strength and wronged himself in such a place. Thinking of this, Colin suddenly felt that Orlando might not be able to easily deceive the Eastern region and replace Capone as the leader of Alfalfa City's underground forces. However, he didn't care about this now. Alfalfa City wasn't a strategic point in Colin's plan. Even if the Eastern region regained control, it wouldn't have a big impact. He was actually able to get a 6th-rank blood slave this time, which was already a big gain. As for Orlando, it would depend on his own luck. If he could smoothly pass, it would naturally be a surprise for Colin. If not, then he could only blame himself for his bad luck. In such a hierarchical world, it was extremely difficult for a commoner to become a fish that leaped over the dragon's gate. Colin wouldn't easily change his strategy or waste his resources for such a thief leader. In short, Orlando could only rely on himself. Colin hoped that he would be able to see another surprise in the near future. While he was thinking, Capone had already put on a full set of armor under Colin's instructions, covering himself tightly. Bang bang. Colin reached out and patted Capone's helmet twice as he revealed a smug smile. Now that he had 2 blood thralls of the 6th step, Colin felt that he could officially consider hunting a knight of the 6th step. Of course, before that, Colin had to stabilize the half-elf kingdom. After settling Capone down, Colin left the basement. The basement led directly to the Queen's study. However, considering that Aisha was about to give birth, Colin did not allow her to work anymore and sent her to rest. Only Colin's half-elf maid, Kathy Savoy, was in the study. On this trip to Silver Moon City, Colin had brought Kathy along. It was an opportunity for her to go home and take a look. However, this half-elf maid did not return to the Savoy family's manor even once after arriving at Silver Moon City, as if she had completely cut off all ties with them. Seeing Colin walk up from the basement, Kathy hurriedly poured him a cup of coffee and reported at the same time, "Master, Duke Modwin came to look for you just now. Seeing that you were not around, he left behind a handwritten letter." Colin nodded, indicating that he understood. Although Queen Aisha had already returned to Silver Moon City, she was about to give birth. Many of the affairs of the half-elf kingdom were still handled by Duke Modwin. However, Duke Modwin would report to Colin every day. Obviously, he was very clear about who held the authority of the half-elf kingdom. Colin sat down in front of the desk, drinking coffee as he flipped through the handwritten letter that Duke Modwin had left behind. It listed the affairs of the kingdom that had been handled by Duke Modwin. At the same time, he reminded Colin once again that there was a large group of rebels gathered in Silver Moon City, and they were plotting something. Seeing this, Colin could not help but smile mysteriously. Duke Modwin had reminded him many times about this rebel force. He had even suggested that they should be arrested before they took action, so as to not disturb the Queen's delivery. However, Colin had never agreed to it. Instead, he had asked him to be patient and wait patiently. This time, Colin had indulged these rebel forces so that all the half-elves who were dissatisfied with Queen Aisha would take the initiative to jump out. This way, Colin would be able to capture them all in one fell swoop, so as to prevent any more trouble in the future. Moreover, with the blood cavalry in the city, Colin was not worried that the situation would be out of his control. Even if the Silver Moon Guard were to rebel, Colin was confident that he could forcefully suppress them. What he was worried about now was whether there would be anyone who had designs on the Queen and the child that was about to be born. For this reason, Colin had already replaced all the guards in Queen Aisha's chamber with the Blood Shadow Guards. With the current combat power of the Blood Shadow Guards, unless a powerhouse of the Sanctuary Realm appeared or an army of tens of thousands charged into the half-elven palace, no one would be able to get close to Queen Aisha. The only thing he had to be wary of were the doctors and maids who were attending to Queen Aisha's delivery. However, these doctors and maids were personally selected by Aisha, so there should be no problem in terms of loyalty. At the thought of this, Colin put down the letter and was about to leave the study when he saw Kathy still standing there with her hands behind her back. She looked like she wanted to say something, but was hesitating. "Kathy, is there anything else?" "Master, there's something I need to report to you." "Speak." Kathy carefully lifted her head to look at Colin and said softly, "Master, Baron Savoy sent someone to contact me yesterday." Colin knew that the Baron Kathy was talking about should be her cousin. Back when Kathy had helped Colin lure the Sky Horse army to attack Silver Moon City, Colin had promised to give the Savoy family the title of Baron after the deed was done. However, Kathy herself would rather be Colin's maid than become a baron of the half-elven kingdom. Hence, the title of baron fell to her cousin. "Why did he look for you?" Colin asked with a smile, as if he had realized something. Kathy hesitated for a moment, but still said honestly, "He was asking me about the doctor who attended to Her Majesty's delivery." Colin's eyes narrowed. Seeing this, Kathy hurriedly explained, "Master, don't worry. I didn't tell him anything." Colin nodded with satisfaction. "You did well. However, I suggest that you make a trip back to the Savoy family. If Baron Savoy asks again, tell him the identity of the doctor who attended to the delivery." But Kathy was dumbfounded and stuttered, not knowing what to do. Colin smiled as he walked to Kathy, patted her shoulder, and said gently, "Just do what you need to do. Don't worry, just do it. I've already arranged everything. Actually, I'm also very curious. What kind of tricks are those people up to?" "Yes, Master." Kathy nodded, but her eyes couldn't help but reveal a tinge of sadness. Colin understood that Kathy was worried about her family, so he comforted her, "You've been with me for so long, you should know that I'm not a bloodthirsty person. Hence, the Savoy family won't be cut off. On the contrary, after getting rid of the rotten branches, Your family will be able to develop even better. Master, I understand. Kathy was relieved. She nodded and left. Colin looked at her retreating figure and smiled as he muttered to himself, I've given you a chance. I've given you a chance, but don't let me down. Chapter 376. A carriage with simple decorations slowly drove into Silvermoon City's business district, stopping in front of a luxurious house. The door of the car opened, and a tall young man walked out. He was wearing a wide triangular hat, and his head was lowered. His face couldn't be seen clearly, but from the small details of his posture, one could tell that he was a noble with an extraordinary background. I'm sorry, sir. May I have a look at your invitation? The attendant politely stopped the young man. But before the young man could show his invitation, a short, fat, and slightly bald middle-aged man in a floral robe rushed out with vigorous steps. He pushed the attendant aside and welcomed the young man in with a fawning expression. The attendant who had been pushed aside stared at the scene with his mouth agape, unable to come back to his senses for a long time. Of course, he didn't dare get angry, because the middle-aged man who had rushed out was the legendary half-elf merchant of Silvermoon City, Javier. So, the attendant was just a little surprised. Who was the young man that Javier had to welcome him personally, and with such a humble attitude? After entering the house, the young man took off his hat, revealing a resolute, handsome, yet somewhat cold face. If Colin were here, he would definitely recognize the young man as his old acquaintance, Marquis Vincent. The eldest son of the Duke of the Eastern Region had returned to Silvermoon City after more than half a year. Marquis Vincent's brows were tightly furrowed, perhaps because he'd recalled some unpleasant memories from the last time he'd been here. Javier smiled along the way, saying some witty words, but Marquis Vincent's expression didn't turn for the better, which made him even more anxious. As the central building of Silvermoon City's business district, the decorations here could be said to be extremely luxurious. At a glance, all one could see was magnificent gold paint. Even the cracks in the white glaze on the ground were covered with melted gold. Unfortunately, this style of nouveau riche obviously couldn't enter Marquis Vincent's eyes. Not only was he unable to look at it, he couldn't smell it either. The moment Marquis Vincent entered, he couldn't help but cover his nose. The fragrance here was too strong, so strong that it choked his nose. Of course, Marquis Vincent could understand why. Half-elf female slaves in light gauze dresses were displaying their beautiful naked bodies in front of the guests. If the guests were interested, they could discuss with them the pleasure that wasn't for the sake of reproduction. Although Marquis Vincent didn't like these lowly female slaves, not everyone was so reserved. The smell of perfume in the room couldn't completely cover the stench of pheromones. Javier was smart enough to notice Marquis Vincent's discomfort. He quickly asked the maid to open all the windows for some fresh air. Lord Marquis, this time I have gathered the leaders of the 17 most influential half-elf merchant guilds in Silvermoon City to listen to your teachings. Marquis Vincent finally showed a satisfied expression. He nodded and followed Javier into the conference hall. The hall was very spacious. The round table made of gold-plated oak was very eye-catching. The conference chairs made of white-striped tiger hide were also very exquisite, but the overall style was less serious. Seeing Marquis Vincent walk in, the merchants sitting around the table stood up and bowed to greet him. Marquis Vincent raised his hand and gestured for everyone to sit down. Javier brought Marquis Vincent to the main seat and said in a clear voice, "Everyone, today we have the honor of inviting the first successor of the House of St. Prospero, Marquis Vincent. I'm sure everyone knows why this conference is being held. We, the Half-Elf Merchant Guild, cannot be trampled on by others. We must fight for our own interests. Fortunately, we are not fighting alone. Marquis Vincent has brought the support of the Duke of the Eastern Region to our Half-Elf Merchant Guild. Please believe that as long as we work together, we will definitely be able to make our voices heard." Javier was very good at livening up the atmosphere. He also understood that although the merchants were rich, they lacked status. They wanted to be respected more than anyone else. Next, let's invite the Honorable Marquis Vincent to speak for us. After he finished speaking, Javier sat down on the first seat on the left. The meeting room was immediately filled with warm applause and praises. Vincent smiled reservedly. As the honorable Marquis of the Eastern region, he actually looked down on these lowly, vulgar, and mercenary merchants from the bottom of his heart. If it weren't for his own plan, he wouldn't sit at the same table with these people. Marquis Vincent looked around and said, "I don't want to waste time talking nonsense, so I'll get straight to the point." After a short pause, Marquis Vincent picked up the silver teacup and took a sip. The fragrance of the tea lingered in his mouth and calmed him down a bit. He continued, "The reason why you are gathered here is that you don't want the food you worked so hard to accumulate to be bought by Count Angeli in the northern frontier at a low price. However, facing the power of the northern frontier and the favoritism of Queen Aisha, you don't dare to openly resist. However, you don't have to worry. The half-elf kingdom isn't a territory of the northern frontier. It's also not a garden that Queen Aisha can play with as she pleases." Hearing this, the half-elf merchants sitting around the table became spirited and looked at Marquis Vincent with expectant eyes. "I can tell you clearly that Silvery Moon City is about to experience a huge change. From now on, this place is no longer a place where Queen Aisha or Count Angeli can do whatever they want. In that case, everyone, I wonder if you're willing to contribute to this?" After hearing this, the half-elf merchants all expressed their willingness to cooperate with Marquis Vincent. They already knew that Queen Aisha was a puppet supported by Count Angeli. Even the child in her belly was most likely Count Angeli's. A queen like this would never be able to protect the interests of the half-elf kingdom, and it would be impossible for her to gain the support of these half-elf merchants. Marquis Vincent nodded with satisfaction and said, "Good. Since everyone is so enthusiastic, I'm relieved. I've already arranged for people to do the scheming and fighting. As for everyone, I only hope that you can do one thing within the scope of your abilities. Lord Marquis, if you need us to do anything, please tell us directly." Havel immediately stood up and spoke on behalf of the half-elf merchants. Marquis Vincent also stood up from his seat. His gloomy eyes slowly swept over the half-elf merchants, then he said in a serious tone, "I want you to burn all the grain stores." "What?" After hearing this, the half-elf merchants' faces all changed. They never thought that the Marquis of the Eastern region would actually want them to do such a thing. "What? You don't want to do it?" Marquis Vincent coldly asked. Facing this kind of question, the half-elf merchants all lowered their heads and didn't dare to speak. But after a moment of silence, a half-elf merchant finally stood up and said, "Lord Marquis, what you're doing is even more excessive than Count Angeli. Although his price is low, at least we won't suffer a loss. But what you're doing will cause us to suffer a huge loss. Rather than that, we might as well cooperate with Count Angeli." Marquis Vincent chuckled and said, "You know what? This is the first objection I've received since coming to Silver Moon City." The half-elf merchant straightened his neck and said firmly, "Lord Marquis, if you still don't care about the interests of your allies, you'll only receive more objections in the future." "Are you lecturing me? I wouldn't dare. I'm just advising you." "Advising?" Marquis Vincent stood up calmly and slowly walked behind the half-elf merchant. He put his hands on his shoulders and said with a smile, "But you know what? Only my father, the Duke of the Eastern region, has the qualifications to talk to me in such a tone." The half-elf merchant wanted to continue arguing, but he saw the shock and disbelief in the eyes of others. Before he could figure out what was going on, Marquis Vincent, who was behind him, picked up the table knife that was used to eat desserts on the table with a sinister smile, grabbed his hair, and viciously stabbed it into his eyes. The table knife, which wasn't considered sharp, was pushed by the huge force and stabbed into the half-elf merchant's eyeball without any resistance. It went deep into his brain. Blood and brain matter splattered on the white tablecloth, like blooming flowers. The blood-curdling screams that sounded like pigs being slaughtered echoed, but they became weaker and weaker. Finally, it returned to a deathly silence. Marquis Vincent acted like he had done something insignificant. He calmly took out a white silk handkerchief, wiped the blood on his hands, and casually covered the corpse in front of him. After doing all this, a satisfied smile appeared on his face, as if the violence that had accumulated since entering Silver Moon City had finally been vented. Now, who else objects? Chapter 377. The air in the conference hall seemed to have frozen. No one dared to make a sound, and they even tried their best to control their breathing. The thick smell of blood gradually filled the air, and the half-elf merchants finally realized one thing: nobles would kill. No matter how gentle and kind they were, from the beginning to the end, the nobles' rule was built on violence. No matter how rich the merchants were, they were just lambs waiting to be slaughtered in front of the nobles. Marquis Vincent used a bloody corpse to make the half-elf merchants realize the cruel reality. Some of them had ashen faces, but they didn't dare to say anything. Some were terrified and avoided eye contact. Some were dejected and had completely accepted their fate. Javier was sweating profusely, and his heart was filled with regret. He thought that he had invited a strong ally, but he didn't expect that this wasn't a strong ally, but a wolf. If that was the case, he felt that he should have just followed Count Angeli. Just as everyone was sitting on pins and needles, a half-elf merchant hesitantly raised his hand and stuttered, Lord Martin, I drank too much water. I need to go to the toilet." My Vincent glanced at that person and coldly said, "Hold it in." That person's face turned pale, and he laughed dryly as he nodded. He seemed to be talking to himself. All right, I can still hold it in." The conference room was filled with an oppressive atmosphere, and it was almost suffocating. Finally, Marquis Vincent spoke again. "Let's continue the topic. I know that you are worried about your food, but if you want to change Silvery Moon City, how can you not pay a price? Do you really think that you don't have to do anything and can just sit back and enjoy the fruits of others' labor?" Marquis Vincent's gaze swept around, and he found that no one dared to look him in the eye. No one dared to refute him, so his tone became gentler. "Of course, after this matter is completed, you will also get a share of the profits. Perhaps it will be able to make up for your losses." Hearing this, everyone's faces lit up with joy, and they all began to praise the kindness and generosity of the House of St. Prospero. Marquis Vincent sneered inwardly as he watched these mercenary merchants change their faces, but he didn't show it on his face. At this point, the two sides finally reached an agreement. According to Marquis Vincent's request, the half-elf merchants would ignite their own granaries at the designated time to cause chaos. After overthrowing the rule of Queen Aisha and driving away the army of the north, they would receive part of the compensation from the east. However, Marquis Vincent didn't mention how much and how he would compensate them. If it was in the past, the half-elf merchants would definitely scoff at such empty promises. But now, facing the powerful Marquis Vincent and that bloody corpse, they didn't dare to ask any questions. At this time, they could only comfort themselves. The House of St. Prospero's reputation should still be trustworthy. Seeing that he had achieved his goal, Marquis Vincent ignored the merchant's passionate pleas for him to stay and walked out. Outside the door, the low-key carriage was still parked in the same place, but there were more guards around it. Marquis Vincent impatiently dismissed Javier and the rest, and walked to the front of the carriage alone. He asked the knight beside him, "Have you invited Duke Modwin?" The knight's face stiffened and he shook his head. "Sir, Duke Modwin isn't willing to come." Marquis Vincent frowned and was about to scold him, but he heard the knight say, "However, we have invited Duke Modwin's son, Charlie Modwin." Marquis Vincent's face softened and he asked, "How many sons does Duke Modwin have?" "Just this one." "Good." Marquis Vincent nodded and stepped into the carriage. The interior of the carriage was spacious, and the decorations were more luxurious than the exterior. "Respected Marquis Vincent, welcome to Silvery Moon City." Looking at the young boy in front of him, Marquis Vincent smiled and said, "Charlie, how old are you?" "I'm 12 years old this year, respected Marquis." Marquis Vincent nodded and gestured for Charlie to sit down. He then sat down himself and lamented, "Your father doesn't dare to come and see me. Is he afraid that I'll blame him for lying to me last time?" "Father lied to you?" Charlie asked blankly. Marquis Vincent suddenly realized that this little guy in front of him didn't know anything at all, and the reason he appeared in his carriage was probably the result of the House of Medea being dissatisfied with Queen Aisha's rule. Therefore, Marquis Vincent lost the desire to chat with this little kid, and he smiled. "That's some old story, so I won't go into it. Charlie, Do you know why you came to see me? Oh? To overthrow Queen Aisha's rule, Charlie said in a young voice, and his expression was very serious. Marquis Vincent looked at the little boy in front of him with interest, and continued to ask, "Then tell me, how do you plan to overthrow Queen Aisha's rule?" "Queen Aisha is about to give birth, and I'll take this opportunity to lead the Silver Moon Guard into the palace and force her to return the throne to the House of Media." "So you're saying that you have the confidence to make the Silver Moon Guard listen to your orders?" "But the commander of the Silver Moon Guard is clearly your father, right? Will he agree to your actions?" "Father is a coward," Charlie said disdainfully, "but I've already met the uncles of the Silver Moon Guard, and they all support me." "That's impressive," Marquis Vincent praised, but he was sneering in his heart. The half-elf nobles really have guts to actually let a little kid take the lead. But of course, Marquis Vincent would not remind Charlie that his uncles were only afraid of taking responsibility and pushed him to take the lead. Marquis Vincent's praise made Charlie raise his head proudly, as if he could already see the annoying Queen Aisha begging for forgiveness in front of him. "Charlie, why do you want to overthrow Queen Aisha's rule?" "Because the half-elf throne originally belonged to the House of Media, and grandfather also told me that Aisha is a bad woman." Marquis Vincent was stunned for a moment before he realized that the grandfather Charlie was referring to was the old half-elf king, who was also Queen Aisha's husband. Thinking of this, a satisfied smile appeared on his face, and he nodded, "Good. As expected of a young hero from the House of Media. Don't worry, the East doesn't like Queen Aisha, and when the time is right, I'll stand up and support the House of Media." "Thank you for your support. The friendship between the House of St. Prospero and the House of Media will last forever." Seeing that his empty words had made Charlie so grateful, Marquis Vincent couldn't help but laugh coldly in his heart, and at the same time, lament. The House of Media was really getting worse with each generation. The old king was a strong opponent that even the Duke of the East had to take seriously. As for Prince William, who was now Duke Modwin, even though he wasn't very smart, he could at least see the situation clearly. As for Charlie, of course, Marquis Vincent definitely didn't care about the future of the House of Media, and he didn't have any psychological burden to send a teenager to the battlefield. Marquis Vincent only sent Charlie off after a few more words of encouragement. Sitting alone in the carriage, Marquis Vincent fell into deep thought. He was very clear that if he wanted to rely on the half-elf merchants and the Silver Moon Guard led by a brat to overturn Silver Moon City, it would still be a fool's dream. Fortunately, his plan didn't stop there. Thinking of this, Marquis Vincent reached out and knocked on the side of the carriage, instructing, "To the Temple of Destiny." Chapter 378. In the Half-Elven Palace. Colin walked through the dark corridor and came to a secret basement. The air was filled with the faint smell of blood and the lingering smell of death. "What? Failed again?" Hearing the voice behind them, the three half-elven female doctors in the basement came back to their senses and quickly greeted Colin. Colin waved his hand casually, indicating that they did not need to be so polite. Then, he walked to an operation table in the middle of the basement and found that the two monkeys on the table, one big and one small, had become corpses. One of the female doctors said with a sad face, "I'm sorry, my lord. We have tried many times, but we still can't successfully complete the cesarean section operation you mentioned." "Because you can't control the blood loss?" Colin looked at the blood flowing everywhere and asked. "Yes, my lord." "Then you should be able to use this method to take the fetus out of the mother's body, right?" The female doctor hesitated for a moment and nodded, "Yes, but, my lord, if you use this method, the fetus may have a chance to survive, but the mother will definitely die." The three female doctors had of course guessed why Colin wanted them to test this cesarean section operation. When they thought that they might have to use this method to cut open Her Majesty's belly, they could not help but tremble. If anything happened to Her Majesty or the fetus in her belly, they would definitely not be able to escape the blame. Therefore, the three doctors only hoped that Colin could recognize the reality and give up this completely impossible method. "I know." Colin nodded, "You can go and rest. This experiment ends here." The three female doctors looked at each other and wanted to ask if Colin had completely given up this so-called cesarean section operation. However, looking at Colin's cold and expressionless face, no one dared to speak first. They could only anxiously bow and leave. Colin looked at the mess on the operation table and did not feel anything in his heart. The failure of the female doctors did not surprise him. With the underdeveloped surgical skills in this world, it would be a miracle if they could successfully perform a cesarean section. However, Colin still let the female doctors experiment a few times on the monkeys. It was not that he expected them to succeed, but to let them familiarize themselves with the position of the fetus in the mother's belly and how to remove the fetus through surgery. In this way, if Aisha really had a difficult birth, there would be an emergency plan. As for the failure of these experiments, Colin did not care. After all, blood loss or infection and other factors that could cause a cesarean section operation to fail were not a problem for vampires. Of course, this kind of cesarean section was just a precaution. Colin definitely hoped that this set of measures would not come in handy. Leaving the basement, Colin wanted to talk to Aisha, but when he reached the door of the palace, he found Duke Muller was waiting outside. "Earl, are you here to visit Her Majesty?" Duke Muller greeted with a flattering smile. Duke Muller was Aisha's brother. After the death of the previous Duke Muller, he inherited the title of the Miller family. "Yes." Colin nodded and asked in confusion, "Why don't you go in?" Duke Muller rubbed his hands and said awkwardly, "Mother is whispering to Her Majesty inside." Colin immediately understood. It was Duke Muller's mother, Madame Sharon, who was also Queen Aisha's mother. The mother and daughter were probably talking about things to take note of during childbirth. No wonder Duke Muller wanted to hide outside. Colin rubbed his nose. He knew that it wasn't a good time for him to go in, so he stood beside Duke Muller and thought about what to say to ease the awkward atmosphere. Fortunately, Duke Muller spoke first. "Earl, I heard that Silver Moon City hasn't been very peaceful recently." Colin glanced at him and asked with a smile, "What's not peaceful?" Seeing that Colin was asking the obvious, Duke Muller was a little anxious and didn't try to hide it anymore. "Earl, I don't believe that you haven't heard the news. Many nobles in Silver Moon City are secretly colluding with each other, preparing to rebel while Her Majesty is in labor and weak." Colin immediately pretended to be shocked and asked, "You should report such an important matter to Her Majesty." "I already told Her Majesty. But I don't know what Her Majesty is thinking. She just won't listen to me." Duke Muller said bitterly, "Earl, I know that Her Majesty has always been very respectful of you, so you should also advise Her Majesty." Colin stroked his chin and seemed to be moved. He asked, "Then, Duke Muller, according to what you said, what should Her Majesty do?" "First, she has to stabilize the Silver Moon Guard." Duke Muller blurted out, "Her Majesty shouldn't hand over the command of the Silver Moon Guard to Duke Modowin at this critical juncture." "You think that Duke Modowin will rebel?" "That's a possibility. After all, the House of Medea used to be the half-elven royal family. William Modowin didn't inherit the throne, so it's inevitable that he would resent Her Majesty." Colin nodded thoughtfully but didn't say anything. Duke Muller saw this and continued to agitate. Furthermore, Her Majesty actually let Duke Modowin take over the kingdom's political affairs. This military and political power is concentrated in one person's hands. Wouldn't that make Duke Modowin the de facto king of the half-elves? You have to know that the key to power is balance. Hearing Duke Muller ramble on about the balance of power, Colin secretly rolled his eyes. Of course, he knew what Aisha's brother was thinking. He was just jealous of Duke Modowin. However, to be honest, Colin could understand Duke Muller. After all, he was the Queen's brother and yet he was not favored by an outsider. It was natural for him to feel unbalanced. But this also showed that Duke Muller didn't see through Colin and Aisha's plan to lure the snake out of its hole. Otherwise, he wouldn't be envious of Duke Modowin's current position. It was a fire pit. Similarly, this also showed that Queen Aisha didn't reveal her plan to Duke Muller. Thinking of this, Colin couldn't help but narrow his eyes. It seemed that Aisha didn't trust her brother too much. Duke Muller was still patiently showing off his political views. Colin was annoyed and was about to change the topic. But at this moment, there was a sudden rush of footsteps behind him. Turning his head, Colin saw Queen Aisha's mother, Madame Sharon, running out in panic. "Mother, what's wrong?" Duke Muller hurriedly asked. Madame Sharon was half anxious and half excited as she shouted, "Her Majesty is about to give birth." Chapter 379. As soon as Colin gave the order, a group of bloody cavalry surrounded the Queen's bedroom so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. At the same time, there were also blood shadow guards guarding the place in the dark to ensure that Aisha's labor would not be disturbed by the outside world. 3 female doctors who were on standby were called over, and a group of trained maids immediately got to work. Some boiled water, some ironed cloth. Everything was carried out in an orderly manner. However, Colin and Duke Muller could not help in this busy situation. They could only stand outside the delivery room. Duke Muller walked around anxiously, looking at Colin's expression from time to time. He wanted to say something, but when he saw Colin's expressionless face, he swallowed his words. Time passed slowly. Duke Muller looked at the maids coming in and out to deliver all kinds of things. He heard the faint cries of pain coming from the delivery room. He could not help but ask, "Why hasn't she come out yet?" Colin put his hands behind his back and looked at the setting sun with deep eyes. He said calmly, "It's not that fast to give birth to a child." You're right. Duke Muller looked embarrassed. When he was about to say something, he suddenly stared at the sky in the north of the palace and exclaimed, "Smoke? Smoke? Why is there smoke?" Colin also saw the direction Duke Muller was pointing at, but he did not look surprised. It was as if this was all within his expectations. In the blink of an eye, a few more plumes of thick smoke rose from Silver Moon City. And this seemed to be a signal. Suddenly, noisy noises could be heard everywhere in the city. Even Colin, who was far away in the palace, could vaguely hear it. What's going on? Duke Muller's forehead could not help but break out in a cold sweat. His eyes were filled with infinite fear. Obviously, he had realized that something was wrong. Colin could no longer keep silent. He shouted loudly, "Roger?" Knight Roger strode towards Colin and knelt down on one knee. "Sir, what can I do for you?" The corners of Colin's mouth curled up slightly, revealing a bloodthirsty smile. "This is the first battle after bloody cavalry changed its name. Don't let me down." Bang! Knight Roger slammed his left hand heavily on his chest armor and loudly said, "Yes." With that, he turned around and strode away. Duke Muller stared blankly at the scene before him. "Your lordship, did you foresee this from the start?" Colin turned around and smiled. "Duke, I'm not an idiot. How could I be unprepared?" Now, it was up to the rebels to see what tricks they could play. I hope it won't disappoint me too much." Duke Muller looked at Colin, who had a calm expression but was emitting a bloodthirsty aura. He couldn't help but shudder. At the same time, he sighed. Was Silver Moon City about to experience another night of bloodshed? Who is mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard? Why didn't I know? Duke Modwin roared angrily. Other than anger in his eyes, there was also a touch of unconcealable fear. In fact, he had long known about the undercurrents in Silver Moon City. He had reminded Queen Aisha to be careful many times, but unfortunately, the Queen had not paid attention to it. However, the Queen could ignore it, but as the commander of the Silver Moon Guard, Duke Modwin could not ignore some signs of rebellion in the army. So, he had been paying attention to the situation of the Silver Moon Guard. He had been chatting with the officers of the Guard, explaining the pros and cons to them, and warning them not to be fooled by some conspirators. Even so, when things came to a head, Duke Modwin realized in despair that a portion of the Silver Moon Guard was out of his control. "Your lordship, the Silver Moon Guard went to put out the fire, *T. Duke Modwin interrupted rudely. "I asked who mobilized the Silver Moon Guard, not why." The subordinate immediately shrunk his head and did not dare to make a sound. Moreover, no matter what the reason is, shouldn't they have gotten my permission before mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard? Duke Modwin roared angrily. He knew very well that putting out the fire was *T. No matter how big the fire was, there was no need to mobilize the Silver Moon Guard to save it. Those people mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard only had one goal: Queen Aisha. Thinking of this, Duke Modwin could no longer keep his cool. He kicked the subordinate in front of him to the ground and then strode out. But just as he stepped out, Duke Modwin was stopped. "Uncle Kamez?" Duke Modwin looked at the old man in front of him and had a bad feeling. Kamez Modwin stood with his hands behind his back and asked expressionlessly, "William, what are you going to do in such a hurry?" Duke Modwin took a deep breath and said honestly, "Uncle, someone mobilized the Silver Moon Guard without my permission. They have bad intentions. I have to stop them immediately." "No need." "What?" Kamez stared at Duke Modwin with his cloudy eyes and said calmly, "Because the person who mobilized the Silver Moon Guard is your son, Charlie." Duke Modwin was stunned as if he was struck by lightning. He was speechless for a long time. Seeing this, Kamez continued, "Don't even think about stopping them. Charlie is probably almost at the north gate of the palace and is ready to attack." Hearing this, the light in Duke Modwin's eyes disappeared. He asked painfully, "Why? Do you want the House of Medea to be destroyed?" "Destroyed?" Kamez laughed coldly and said disdainfully, "William, have you forgotten how the House of Medea lost the half-elf throne? It was all because of your cowardice. Back then, as the first successor to the throne, you actually gave in to Colin and Aisha, that adulterous pair, and gave up the throne for nothing. This is a great humiliation. Do you know why Aisha dared to hand the Silver Moon Guard to you? Why did she dare to let you preside over the kingdom when she was about to give birth? Because she saw through you. She knew that you didn't dare to resist. The hatred, glory, and faith of the family have long been thrown aside. You only think about how to curry favor with Aisha. If we let you go on like this, the House of Medea will really fall into the abyss of destruction." Duke Modwin stared at his uncle as if he was getting to know him all over again. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, revealing a mocking smile, and said, "Uncle, I admit that I'm not smart. Father has always been dissatisfied with me because of this. But do you know why he didn't change his successor when he was alive?" Kamez was stunned and asked, "Why?" "Because, although I'm stupid, but—" The mockery on Duke Modwin's face became more obvious. "But you are even more stupid." Kamez's face flushed red, but he suppressed his anger and coldly snorted, "William, don't talk nonsense anymore. Do you have a choice now? Your only son, Charlie, is attacking the palace. Do you really think you can stay out of it? No, soon the nobles of Silver Moon City will think that you are the mastermind of this rebellion. Even if you do nothing now and watch Charlie get killed by the blood cavalry, do you really think you can continue to gain the trust of the queen in the future?" Duke Modwin's face showed that he was struggling, but he still did not give in. Kamez continued to persuade, "Charlie is your only son. Do you really have the heart to do that? We can't win against Count Angeli." Duke Modwin shouted in a low voice. "William, your cowardice disappoints me," Kamez said coldly, "but I can tell you that the participants of this rebellion are far more than you can imagine. Do you not even have the courage to take a gamble now?" Duke Modwin lowered his head, and his fingernails were already digging into his palms. Kamez waited for a while, but did not receive any response from Duke Modwin. He was disappointed. But just as he was about to turn around and leave, ignoring the cowardly patriarch, Duke Modwin suddenly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a cold madness as he growled in a low voice. "All right, then let's take another gamble." Chapter 380. Boom. The huge battering ram hit the thick north gate of the half-elven palace, shaking the whole palace wall and causing fine dust to fall down. One more time, and we can definitely break it open." Charlie waved his long sword and shouted loudly. His young face was full of excitement. Behind him, thousands of Silver Moon Guard officers and soldiers also raised their swords and cheered, waiting for the moment when the palace gate would be broken open. This scene seemed to be somewhat dark and humorous, because the half-elven palace had always been guarded by the Silver Moon Guard. But at this moment, they became the party that was trying to break in. Since Colin entered the Silver Moon City, he immediately let the blood cavalry take over the defense of the palace, which led to this scene. Boom. The palace gate made of fine iron shook again, but it still stood stubbornly. However, the rebel army outside the palace gate suddenly became even more noisy because they could clearly see that spiderweb-like cracks had appeared on the walls around the palace gate. A strange sense of excitement was boiling in the rebel army's chest. Half-Elven Palace. The place they had sworn to guard with their lives. There were a lot of gold and silver treasures, young maids, and the beautiful half-elf queen. These seemed to be waving to them, luring them to rush into the place that used to be extremely majestic and sacred, to find everything they dreamed of and take it for themselves. But at this moment, a rebel army officer suddenly felt something strange. He turned around and looked in the direction behind him. Then, his eyes were quickly filled with fear. Cavalry! Cavalry! It's the blood cavalry! Charlie was still immersed in the excitement of the palace gate being broken. When he heard the shouting of the officer next to him, he immediately said with dissatisfaction, "Why are you panicking? Don't we have a reserve team behind us?" However, just as they were talking, the black cavalry had appeared at the end of the road. The bright red flag was particularly dazzling. The wide main road outside the palace gave the cavalry room to perform. Before they saw the palace gate, the bloody cavalry lined up in 7 rows and galloped on the street without any scruples. Anyone who blocked their way and couldn't escape was knocked down to the ground and trampled into meat paste. At this time, no one could slow down their speed in front of them. The so-called innocent people were not in the consideration of these bloody cavalry soldiers. There was only one thing on their minds. When they reached the rebel army, they had to charge forward as fast as they could. Then, he would use the terrifying impact brought about by this speed to tear apart the enemy formation. It didn't take long for the sound of galloping horses to turn from vague to clear. When Charlie was still questioning why the reserve team behind him did not block this batch of cavalry, the vanguard of the bloody cavalry had been clearly seen. They all wore blood-red armor and held long sabers in their hands. They lined up in a neat and typical charging formation, filling up the entire long street. Even in the city, the soldiers of the bloody cavalry still carried out a full-speed charge with their superb horsemanship and courage. This kind of incomparably terrifying and incomparably crazy aura was something that no one who had not faced directly would ever be able to imagine. "Shield up! Shield up!" The rebel officer roared, but the desperation in his voice could not be concealed at all. Although they had been mentally prepared to confront the bloody cavalry, at this moment, facing the bloody cavalry that swept over like a gust of wind, the rebels could not help but begin to regret. Compared with the terrible threat in front of them, the various temptations in the palace seemed so pale and powerless. Boom! With countless screams, the first batch of heavy cavalry of the bloody cavalry crashed into the rebel army formation like steel monsters. Dozens of figures were immediately knocked out by the galloping horses. Blood sprayed like rain in the air, and the sound of bones breaking was heard. Even after the reorganization and expansion, the combat effectiveness of the bloody cavalry was still as unstoppable as before. They were like a sharp knife cutting into butter. Their speed was almost not reduced, and they tore a crack in the rebel army formation. With only one charge, the rebels who were full of killing desire immediately became chaotic. They desperately moved to both sides, and even squeezed in the direction of the palace gate that had not been knocked open, in order to avoid the terrible bloody cavalry behind them. Panic spread quickly like a plague. Charlie was still stupefied in the same place, as if he could not believe everything in front of him. Fortunately, the rebel officer beside him held him up by the waist, and decisively rushed to the alley in the east with a group of guards. The leader ran away, and the rebel army completely collapsed. In the open area in front of the palace gate, there were chaotic crowds everywhere. There were still some quick-witted rebels who quickly put down their weapons and shouted that they wanted to surrender. Unfortunately, they collapsed too fast, and the bloody cavalry general did not have time to change the order. So, those bloody cavalry soldiers, like hungry wolves rushing into a flock of sheep, skillfully bent down, waved their swords, and cut the rebels on the side of the horses to the ground row by row with the help of the horses. Countless blood sprayed into the air and sprinkled to the ground. Thousands of cavalrymen galloped through the street in front of the palace gate, leaving corpses and flowing blood on the ground. Crack! the crumbling palace gate slowly opened, and Knight Roger slowly walked out. His indifferent eyes swept over the messy battlefield, but he did not give the order to withdraw his swords. After listening to the cavalry general's report on the situation in the city, Knight Roger thought for a moment and ordered, "Don't care about those warehouses that are on fire, concentrate our forces to suppress the rebel Silver Moon Guard, and find out the mastermind of this rebellion." An officer carefully reminded, "Sir, those places that are on fire are all granaries. I suspect that someone wants to destroy the food in Silver Moon City. If we don't do anything, then the purpose of this trip—" Knight Roger firmly shook his head and said, "No, those granaries are a trap to disperse our forces. Don't be fooled. Our priority is to suppress the rebellion. The food problem is not something you should worry about." "Charlie." Duke Modwin looked at his son who was kneeling in front of him in a trance. The anger in his heart dissipated instantly, and the words of reproach could not come out of his mouth. Even if he knew that he was dragged into the water by his son, Duke Modwin also understood at this time that he had no way out. Under his order, almost all the Silver Moon Guard had been mobilized, and they were constantly gathering at the palace, ready to fight to the death with the Blood Cavalry. This time, the House of Medea had put all their assets on the line, and whether they could regain the half-elf throne or not, success or failure depended on this. "William, the Blood Cavalry is already prepared, and their combat power is really terrifying. We have to avoid them." Camés looked at Charlie's sorry appearance and reminded him with lingering fear. "Uncle, do you have any good suggestions? We can't attack the palace now. The Blood Cavalry must have deployed a lot of troops there, and the streets outside the palace are too wide. The cavalry can rush up. So, we should split up and deploy the troops in the dense areas of the city, so that we can limit the cavalry." Duke Modwin thought for a while and asked, "But what if the Blood Cavalry is entrenched in the palace, and they don't come out to fight with us?" Camés sneered and said, "They won't. Don't forget that the half-elf merchants are burning the granaries now. That is the important purpose of Earl Angeli's trip. The northern frontier needs this batch of food, otherwise, there will be a famine this year. So, the Blood Cavalry can't just sit there and watch the city burn, they will definitely come out." Duke Modwin nodded and said, "Well, let's do as you said." Chapter 381. The night was getting darker. The sound of killing was heard everywhere in Silver Moon City, and the fire was soaring to the sky. The Silver Moon Guard, who used to be the keeper of order, had become the source of chaos at this time. For the granaries that were on fire, not only did they not put out the fire, they even stopped the people who tried to put out the fire, allowing the fire to spread. Such abnormal behavior made the residents of Silver Moon City immediately realize that something was wrong. Then they connected the sound of killing and the corpses and blood that could be seen everywhere on the streets. The word rebellion suddenly came into the minds of many half-elves. So, the panic quickly swept the whole city and intensified the chaos. In the face of all this, the Blood Cavalry did not act rashly. They first firmly guarded the half-elven palace, then divided the troops to control the 4 city gates and the main roads in Silver Moon City. But they did not go deep into the inconvenient alleys. As for the granaries that were on fire, they ignored them. Under the connivance of both sides, the fire became bigger and gradually spread to the surrounding houses. Cries for help, and screams were endless. This was destined to be a chaotic and bloody night. After losing the most basic order, the suppressed ugliness was gradually exposed. Those who used to be submissive had all picked up their weapons. Those who were well-behaved had now become exceptionally ferocious. Those who had enmity with each other immediately fought each other. Those who called themselves brothers had also turned against each other in the end. Blood flowed wantonly in the night. Life, which was already extremely lowly in this chaotic world, became even cheaper. This was no doubt a sinful carnival. In the face of all this, the Blood Cavalry finally could not sit still. Knight Roger did not expect that the rebels were more cunning and vicious than he had imagined. Now it seemed that they would rather burn the entire Silver Moon City and let countless half-elves die in this chaos to force the Blood Cavalry to fight with them in the streets. Of course, Knight Roger was reluctant to let the precious cavalry dismount to fight in the streets. But as time went by, he could not hold on anymore. He couldn't really let the food in Silver Moon City be burned. Otherwise, the winter in the northern frontier would be very difficult to endure this year. So, he finally gave the order to march to the fire. Following this order, batches of bloody cavalry soldiers flowed into the streets of Silver Moon City like trickles. The Silver Moon Guards, who had been waiting for a long time, rushed out one after another. Both sides immediately engaged in a dangerous and tragic melee. At this point, the bloody battle in Silver Moon City had reached its climax. At the same time, Queen Aisha's labor had entered a critical period. In the delivery room, Madame Sharon held her daughter's hand tightly with one hand and kept wiping the sweat on her forehead with the other. "Aisha, come on, come on." On the bed, Queen Aisha's face was pale, and she was sweating profusely. She gritted her teeth and did her best for the birth of her child. However, judging from the expression of the female doctor in charge of the delivery, the progress was not smooth. "How is it?" Madame Sharon turned around and asked anxiously. "Madam, Her Majesty," looking at the doctor's hesitant look, Madame Sharon became more anxious. She quickly took out a tube of medicine from her arms and said to Queen Aisha, "Aisha, this is the energy medicine that I bought at a high price. Drink it quickly." Queen Aisha panted a few times, but shook her head and said, "No need, mother, I still have strength. Don't force yourself at this time. Come and drink it." Queen Aisha firmly pushed Madame Sharon's hand away and said, "The palace also prepared energy medicine, I'll drink that." The female doctor quickly took out a tube of medicine from the medicine box and said, "Yes, madam, we also prepared energy medicine." Madame Sharon frowned and said, "It's okay, it's the same. Come on, Aisha, drink the medicine." As she spoke, she sent the energy medicine that she had prepared to Queen Aisha's mouth. The female doctor reminded her softly, "But madam, Her Majesty can't drink things outside the palace." Madame Sharon was instantly angry. She turned around and scolded, "What do you mean? Are you doubting me?" The female doctor shrank back in fear and quickly shook her head. "No, I don't dare." Seeing this, Queen Aisha panted and said, "Mother, don't blame her. This is the rule of the palace. Everything I eat and drink has to be tried first." Madame Sharon glanced at her daughter and could only nod. "All right, then I won't trouble you. You should drink the medicine prepared by the palace." The female doctor heaved a sigh of relief and quickly went forward to let Queen Aisha drink the energy medicine prepared by the palace. After that, Queen Aisha's face was visibly rosy. It seemed that the medicine was very effective. "Aisha, use more strength, use more strength." Madame Sharon encouraged again. However, as time passed, the situation did not improve. The female doctor who delivered the child became more and more anxious, and she wanted to say something several times but stopped. Seeing this, Madame Sharon could no longer suppress the anxiety in her heart. She immediately got up and personally went to the end of the bed, wanting to check on Queen Aisha's condition. Although she had never delivered a child, Madame Sharon had given birth to 3 children herself, so it was impossible for her to not know anything about this. Therefore, when she lifted the sheet and saw the situation below Aisha, she was stunned. "Aisha, why is there no movement in your cervix? Is that so, mother?" Queen Aisha said indifferently. At the same time, she sat up straight. The painful expression on her face completely disappeared, as if everything that had happened just now was just an illusion. Madame Sharon was stunned, clearly not understanding what was going on. Queen Aisha looked at her mother with bright eyes and said in a deep voice, "Mother, perhaps your energy medicine can help me. Why don't you take it out and let someone try it first before giving it to me to drink?" Madame Sharon opened her mouth and said with a shocked expression, "You're not going to give birth at all, are you?" Queen Aisha did not answer her mother's question. She continued to ask stubbornly, "Mother, where's your energy medicine? Take it out. Since you're not going to give birth, of course, there's no need to drink that medicine." "No, mother, I want to drink it," Queen Aisha said in a tone that left no room for doubt. The doctors and maids in the delivery room were also stunned by the changes in front of them. Her Majesty the Queen was actually pretending to give birth. Although they could not understand why the queen was doing this, they could clearly feel the strange atmosphere. They all lowered their heads in silence, not daring to make a sound. Under Queen Aisha's stern gaze, Madame Sharon's expression became more and more unsightly. However, she did not dare to take out the energy medicine from before. "Mother, when father wanted to marry me into the royal family, I begged you, but you rejected me directly and even told me, as a child of the Miller family, I have the responsibility to contribute to the prosperity of the family, even if the price is my lifetime of happiness." Queen Aisha stared at her mother, deep disappointment and mockery flashing in her eyes. She continued, "So, mother, what price are you going to make me pay for the prosperity of the Miller family this time?" Madame Sharon trembled and weakly defended herself. "Aisha? What do you mean by this? Medicine?" Queen Aisha said coldly, You haven't given birth yet. Why do you need medicine?" Madame Sharon was still playing dumb. However, this kind of stubborn resistance was destined to be futile. Silently, an armored man whose face could not be seen clearly appeared behind Madame Sharon and reached out to lift her up. "What are you doing? Aisha, you can't do this. I'm your mother. Your biological mother." However, not only did these words not evoke Aisha's sympathy, but it also made her eyes even colder. The armored man took out the medicine from Madame Sharon's arms and handed it to the doctor beside him. Queen Aisha's cold order came at the same time. "Go and check if there's any problem." The doctor trembled as he took the medicine and said, "Yes, Your Majesty." Chapter 382. The Temple of Destiny was located in the east of Silvery Moon City. It wasn't in a remote location, but it was exceptionally quiet. It could even be said to be deserted. Many evergreen cypress trees with straight trunks had been transplanted around the temple. They were like silent soldiers, surrounding and protecting the Temple of Destiny, creating a solemn and dignified atmosphere. In fact, when the temple was first built, it hadn't been so quiet. There was an endless stream of half-elves who came to pray, and the bustling scene was even more exaggerated than the most bustling market. However, as the elves disappeared from the radiant moon forest, the half-elves gradually moved closer to the powerful human empires. Their faith leaned more and more towards the radiant god, and not the goddess of destiny. Hence, it was understandable that the Temple of Destiny was neglected. The main building of the temple was made of low-key limestone, occupying an area of 8,000 square meters. The huge prayer hall was 45 meters wide and 120 meters long. The dome in the middle was 50 meters high, and it could accommodate tens of thousands of people praying at the same time. However, such a grand occasion hadn't occurred in a long time. Now, the prayer hall was empty. Even if there were servants cleaning it every day, it was difficult to completely clean up the dust that had accumulated. Silvery Moon City was shrouded in blood and fire tonight, but the Temple of Destiny was still as quiet as before. Whether it was the rebels or the rebels, even if they no longer believed in the goddess of destiny, they wouldn't blaspheme this place. On the balcony at the top of the tower, a beautiful half-elf woman was leaning against the railing, looking at the flames in Silvery Moon City in a daze. She wore a green ceremonial robe, quietly hiding her slender figure. Her exposed skin was white and lustrous, as if it was covered in a layer of bright silver moonlight. However, there was a lingering sadness and pity between her brows. The night breeze blew through her soft hair, creating a sad melody that sounded like she was weeping and complaining. "High Priestess Trisolai, have you thought it through?" Marquis Vincent walked out from the shadows behind Trisolai, his voice carrying some suppressed impatience and annoyance. Trisolai didn't turn her head when she heard this. She was still staring at the flames not far away, as if she hadn't heard the question of the noble Marquis from the east. Marquis Vincent snorted and said angrily, "High Priestess, don't think that this ceremony has to be done by you. You may not know this, but in the past few days, several of your priests have approached me and are willing to help me complete this ritual." Hearing this, there was finally some fluctuation in Trisolai's eyes. She slowly turned around and faced Marquis Vincent. She said calmly and confidently, "Lord Marquis, but you also know that the chances of success will be the highest if I personally preside over this ritual." But if you're not willing, the probability is always 0 to me. If that's the case, why don't I let someone else have a try? Marquis Vincent took a step forward and said coldly, "However, Your Excellency High Priestess, you have to think this through. If someone else were to help me complete this ritual, then I'm afraid that you, the High Priestess of Silver Moon City, will have to abdicate your position." Silly's expression was still indifferent, as if she didn't care about Marquis Vincent's threats. She reached out to tuck her messy hair behind her ears, revealing her swan-like slender neck. Marquis Vincent couldn't help but swallow his saliva, but he didn't act rashly. He remembered that before he left, his father had cautioned him that the only thing he had to be careful of in Silver Moon City was this mysterious high priestess of the goddess of destiny. Lord Marquis Trisalai finally spoke. "It's not that I don't want to help you, but I find it hard to believe that you have the ability to fulfill the promises you made." A trace of anger flashed across Marquis Vincent's face. He said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency High Priestess, I represent the will of my father, the Duke of the Eastern Region. I won't go back on the promises I made to you." "Is that so?" Trisalai was unmoved. She asked back, "Then what about your mother? Will the Archbishop of the Eastern Region of the Radiance Church really agree to let the Temple of Destiny lead the faith of the half-elven kingdom?" "Of course my mother will agree. I've already asked for her opinion on this matter," Marquis Vincent said with certainty. Seeing that Trisalai was still hesitant, Marquis Vincent spoke again. "Your Excellency High Priestess, perhaps in your eyes, the faith of more than 1,000,000 half-elves is very precious, but in the eyes of the Radiance Church, it isn't that important. Moreover, this is the promise of the House of Saint Prospero to you. This is also your only chance to save the Temple of Destiny and restore it to its former glory. If you miss this chance, you can only continue to bitterly wait in this place where no one cares about the hope of salvation. So, what are you still hesitating for?" Trisalai shook her head and said, "If the House of Saint Prospero is really sincere, then please give me some more specific conditions. It shouldn't be an empty promise like, 'Let the Temple of Destiny lead the faith of the half-elves' or something similar." Marquis Vincent took a deep breath and suppressed the impatience in his heart. He asked in a deep voice, "Then, Your Excellency High Priestess, what conditions do you want?" Trisalai gave a sweet smile. She raised her finger and said, "First, the number of priests of the Radiance Church in the half-elven kingdom must be less than 100. Second, 10% of the tax revenue of the half-elven kingdom must be handed over to the Temple of Destiny. Third, the half-elven king or queen must convert to the goddess of destiny." Hearing Trisalai's harsh conditions, Marquis Vincent's expression didn't change. However, he was laughing in his heart. In his opinion, this high priestess of the Temple of Destiny was so naive that it was cute. When Trisalai finished speaking, Marquis Vincent didn't even try to bargain. He immediately agreed, "All right, I agree on behalf of the House of Saint Prospero." Trisalai's amber eyes stared at Marquis Vincent, as if she really believed him. A smile finally appeared on her pretty face. "All right then. I'll help you host the bloodline ceremony. However, I hope you understand that even I can't guarantee that the ceremony will succeed." "I understand." Marquis Vincent was overjoyed. He nodded and said, "However, I must remind you that the conditions you requested will only take effect if the ceremony succeeds." "Of course. If the ceremony fails, then the House of Saint Prospero will no longer have the final say in Silvery Moon City." Marquis Vincent snorted when he heard this. He seemed to be unhappy about this. Trisalai didn't care about Marquis Vincent's feelings at all. She asked in a crisp voice, "All right, where's the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment?" Marquis Vincent hurriedly took out an exquisite small box from his bosom and slowly opened it. A gorgeous multicolored radiance spread out like flowing water, making everything on the balcony seem like a beautiful dream. Trisalai's gaze was fixed on the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment. Her expression instantly became very sincere. "High Priestess, how about this Phoenix Soul Stone fragment that the House of Saint Prospero collected? It should be able to help you complete the ceremony smoothly, right?" Marquis Vincent proudly boasted. Trisalai ignored Marquis Vincent's question. She walked with profound steps towards the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment. She lowered her head and bowed, respectfully performing an ancient ceremony. Then she gently held it with both hands. When she raised her head again, this beautiful high priestess of the goddess of destiny was already in tears. Chapter 383. Half-Elven Palace. Duke Muller noticed that his sister's cries had suddenly stopped coming from the delivery room. He was puzzled and asked, "Why is there no sound? Has she already given birth?" But after a while, he shook his head and muttered to himself, "That can't be right. I didn't hear the baby crying either." Colin, who had been silent all this time, finally turned around. With a strange smile on his face, he said to Duke Muller, "What did the Eastern region promise you?" "What?" Duke Muller was shocked, his face full of astonishment. Colin didn't say anything. He just looked at Duke Muller, his eyes full of ridicule as if his prey had taken the bait. Duke Muller calmed down and pretended to be relaxed as he said, "Your Excellency, should we go in and see what's going on inside?" "What do you think is going on inside?" Colin asked with a smile. "How would I know? If it's convenient, we should go in and take a look. Then what do you want to see inside?" "Of course I want to see Aisha give birth to a healthy baby." Duke Muller tried to maintain a relaxed tone. But Colin still caught a hint of fear and panic in Duke Muller's eyes. "Unfortunately, I'm afraid your expectations will be disappointed." Colin pretended to sigh, as if he really felt sorry for Duke Muller. "Because Her Majesty isn't going to give birth." Colin finished speaking and crossed his arms in front of his chest. He stared at Duke Muller with interest, waiting for his reaction. Duke Muller opened his mouth wide and laughed awkwardly. Your Excellency. You must be joking with me." "I'm not joking with you." Colin stopped smiling and his tone became serious. "This was originally a test that Her Majesty and I discussed. We wanted to see what kind of big fish we could catch." "Ha, who would have thought that Duke Muller would be able to fish you out?" "Viscount, I don't quite understand what you mean." Duke Muller was still stubbornly resisting. Colin sneered. "Duke Muller, did you know? I especially like to watch the prey struggle in the trap. Every time they make a futile struggle for survival, it's so moving, yet so foolish and laughable." Duke Muller could no longer maintain his composure. Beads of cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and his body began to tremble uncontrollably. He opened his mouth wanting to explain himself, but he didn't know what to say. Colin didn't seem to want to listen to Duke Muller's explanation. He continued, "Actually, from the very beginning, I've been very curious about the true killer move of the rebels in Silvermoon City. Those half-elf merchants obviously couldn't do it. Even if they had the courage to burn all their food, so what? At most, the northern frontier would be more difficult this winter, but they couldn't change the situation in Silvermoon City. As for the Silvermoon Guard, with the blood cavalry in the city, what chance did they have to win? Even if they hid in the alleys and took advantage of the terrain to make the blood cavalry lose their biggest advantage, so what? Even if the blood cavalry got off their horses, they were still the best of the best. Maybe they couldn't win easily, but if the Silvermoon Guard thought that they could defeat the blood cavalry, they were too naive. So I realized early that the rebels must have a true killer move. Otherwise, they wouldn't have dared to jump out and court death. So what is this killer move?" Speaking of this, Colin slowly approached Duke Muller. The latter couldn't bear his sharp eyes and extremely oppressive momentum and had to lower his head. "In order to figure this out, Aisha and I planned this scene together. She pretended to be in labor and let the rebels believe that she was at her weakest moment. At this time, I could see their trump card clearly. But I didn't expect that the trump card of the rebels was the Miller family." In the face of Colin's blunt accusation, Duke Muller lowered his head and kept silent, as if he had admitted it. Colin didn't care and continued with a smile, "But to be honest, I wasn't too surprised about this. Since you could use Aisha as a tool for marriage and forced her to marry an old king who had one foot in the grave, it meant that in your heart, you didn't treat her as a family member. So this time, you didn't hesitate to continue sacrificing Aisha. If Aisha gave birth to an accident, then Duke Muller, you should be able to smoothly inherit the half-elf throne, right? You think I'm doing this for the throne?" Duke Muller finally raised his head and angrily glared at Colin as he roared in a low voice. "What is it for?" Colin asked with great interest. "I'm doing this for the half-elf kingdom," Duke Muller said with a strong sense of righteousness. Heh, Colin couldn't help but laugh out loud. In the face of Colin's ridicule, Duke Muller clenched his fists and said firmly, "Colin Angeli, why don't you think about it? Why did this rebellion cause such a big commotion? Almost all the half-elf nobles, generals, soldiers, and merchants are rebelling? Because they know that Aisha, that bitch, isn't worthy of being the half-elf king. She's just a puppet you use to control the half-elves. As long as she's on the throne, the interests of the half-elves will never be guaranteed." "Is that so?" Colin rubbed his chin and lightly asked, "Then tell me, how did we infringe on the interests of the half-elves?" "You forcefully bought the half-elves' food at a low price. But the East asked you to destroy all the food, at least I was willing to pay. You forcefully dispatched the Silver Moon Guard and let the half-elves bleed and sacrifice for you. The Silver Moon Guard is only helping me guard my territory at the northern frontier. I didn't send them to fight any hard battles, and I didn't use them as cannon fodder." "No matter how you quibble, the half-elf kingdom is now a puppet in your hands." Then respected Duke Muller, "If you ascend the throne, won't you become a puppet in the hands of the East?" Duke Muller's face turned red, and he couldn't refute for a while. Colin coldly smiled and disdainfully said, "What do you mean for the half-elf kingdom? That's just an excuse to appease your conscience. Without it, you won't be able to sleep peacefully at night, right? Since it's for the sake of fighting for power, then say it openly. That way, I'll think more highly of you. However, as long as you participate in this game of power, then when you lose, other than admitting it openly, any other excuses will only make you a joke." After saying this, Colin turned around and walked into the delivery room. At the same time, 2 armored men silently appeared behind Duke Muller and restrained him. Duke Muller struggled with all his might and at the same time begged Colin for mercy. Sir Count, I admit defeat, I admit defeat. You can't kill me, you can't kill me. I'm Aisha's brother, her brother." A cold light flashed, and Duke Muller's shouts came to an abrupt end. With a thud, a bloody head rolled to the ground. In the delivery room, Madame Sharon had already fainted, not knowing whether it was because of fear or shame. Seeing Colin walk in, Queen Aisha, who was leaning on the bed, revealed a bright smile. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly saw the night sky outside the window suddenly light up. Colin also looked out in surprise. The dark night sky turned fiery red in an instant, as if the fire in the city had spread to the sky. But of course, Colin knew that the fire on the ground couldn't reach the sky. Just as he was about to walk out to take a closer look, the phantom of a golden phoenix suddenly rushed out of the heavenly fire. With the power to look down on the world, this phantom of a phoenix passed through the vast night sky before anyone could react. It rapidly circled above the half-elven palace before turning into specks of starlight and gradually dissipating. Colin frowned. Just as he was about to ask, he saw Queen Elsa press on her stomach with a pained expression. "Colin, it seems like I'm really going to give birth this time." Chapter 384. They had just experienced a maneuver, so when it came to the real thing this time, the people in the delivery room were not too nervous. They just habitually did their own jobs. Only Colin began to be anxious. Listening to the cry of Aisha from the delivery room and watching the maids coming in and out to deliver various things, Colin stood at the gate of the palace stupidly, but he felt that all this was a bit unreal. But this time, it was indeed real. The wonder in the night sky had disappeared, but the shadow of the phoenix was still lingering in Colin's mind, making him faintly uneasy. What a coincidence! The shadow of the phoenix appeared and disappeared in a flash over the palace, and then Aisha was about to give birth. Although the sequence of time did not necessarily mean the connection of cause and effect, Colin found it hard to believe that there was no relationship between the two. Could it be that this was the real killing move of the rebel forces? But Colin found that he could not understand the opponent's move at all. What was the shadow of the phoenix? What impact did it have on Aisha and the child in her belly? Without knowing these, Colin did not know how to deal with it. He could only pray that his worries were superfluous and Aisha could give birth smoothly. However, as time went by, Colin's heart kept sinking. The glimmer of dawn tore through the dark night and sprinkled the first ray of sunshine in the half-elven palace. The battle in the city had not yet stopped, but according to Knight Roger's report, the bloody cavalry was gradually gaining the upper hand, and it was believed that it would not be long before they could completely suppress the rebellion of the Silver Moon Guard. But Colin was not happy, because the child was still not born smoothly, and Aisha's voice was getting weaker and weaker. Finally, Colin could not bear it anymore and strode into the delivery room. It was reasonable to say that an outsider like Colin should not enter the delivery room of Queen Aisha, but in the current situation, no one dared to say anything. Moreover, everyone was well aware of the true relationship between Colin and Aisha. What's going on? Colin's heart ached when he saw Queen Aisha lying on the bed with a pale face and drenched in sweat. Count, His Majesty? His Majesty doesn't have any strength. The female doctor looked at the gloomy Colin and said carefully. Colin glared at him and said anxiously, "What do you mean by no strength? Didn't you use energy serums?" "Yes, His Majesty has already finished 3 bottles of energy potions, but..." Colin frowned as he realized that something was wrong. Theoretically, as a knight, Aisha should be much stronger than other pregnant women. How could she be so weak during labor? Moreover, Aisha's spirit and energy were still so weak after drinking so many energy elixirs. There was clearly something wrong with her. "Colin?" Queen Aisha shouted weakly. Colin quickly sat by the bed and held Aisha's hand, comforting her gently. "Don't worry, you'll be fine." Aisha shook her head slowly and said, "No, I'm afraid I won't be able to give birth to this child." "Don't be silly. Listen to me. I can feel. The child's aura is too strong." "What do you mean? Do you remember the phoenix illusion you saw last night?" "Yes, what is that?" "That's the totem of the High Elves." Colin knew about this. It was said that the blood of the legendary mythical beast, the phoenix, flowed in the High Elves' bodies. Therefore, their king was called the Phoenix King, and the palace they built in Imperial Dragon City was also called the Phoenix Palace. However, he did not understand why the phoenix illusion appeared in Silver Moon City, and what did it have to do with Aisha's labor. Before he could ask, Queen Aisha continued, "The phoenix bloodline is the symbol of the High Elves' royal family, and the child in my stomach is probably of the phoenix bloodline. I don't know how a half-elf like me could give birth to the phoenix bloodline that even the High Elves' royal family treasures, but such a strong bloodline is beyond my ability to bear. It's constantly absorbing my strength and I can't give birth to it at all." Hearing this, Colin could already confirm that the phoenix illusion was the work of the rebel army. They had used some mysterious method to forcefully increase the bloodline of the child in Aisha's stomach. Originally, giving birth to a child with the phoenix bloodline was a joyous occasion. However, the problem was that Aisha herself was a half-elf, and such a bloodline that was extremely lowly for the High Elves was not enough to naturally give birth to the phoenix bloodline. Hence, to her, the baby in her womb was a huge burden. If this went on, the child would suck all of Aisha's life force dry. Even if she was a blood descendant, she would not be spared. So this was the rebel army's real killer move. Thinking of this, Colin immediately made up his mind and said in a low voice, "Since it can't be born, we'll cut it out." Of course, Aisha understood what Colin meant. She knew about the cesarean section that Colin had prepared. At first, she thought that Colin's actions were superfluous, but she did not expect it to come in handy now. "No, don't." However, Aisha did not agree. She shook her head and begged, "If we do this, our child will die. Don't be silly. If you die, will the child live? We can wait a little longer. I can feel that his breath is stabilizing. Maybe I can hold on a little longer. But Aisha, why do we have to take this risk?" Colin gently kissed Aisha's smooth forehead. "As long as you're alive, we can still have another child. But the child we have in the future can't be said to be the old king's posthumous child. His identity, so what?" Colin said domineeringly. "Even if he's an illegitimate child, I can still help him ascend to the half-elf throne." But Aisha believed in Colin, but as a mother, she could not bear to part with her child. However, Colin knew that he had to harden his heart and make this difficult choice for Aisha. He looked at the tearful Aisha and gritted his teeth. "Don't worry, Aisha. We will definitely take revenge for this." After saying that, he ordered the 3 female doctors who were standing at the end of the bed. "Do it. Cut the child out." The female doctor was so scared that her whole body trembled. "Hurry up." But none of the previous experiments have succeeded. Clang. Colin pulled out the sharp sword at his waist and pointed it at the female doctor. He growled, "Do as I say, or you will be the ones to die." The female doctor looked at the ferocious face of Colin and the sword that was almost at her throat. Finally, she gritted her teeth and took out the scalpel that she had prepared in advance. She whispered a few prayers, and then under Colin's urging, she used her trembling hands to cut open Aisha's belly. Chapter 385. Newborns were ugly. However, it was not enough to scare the experienced female doctor. However, she could not help but tremble as she held the baby girl in her arms. This was because the baby girl did not cry. The female doctor lifted the baby girl by her feet and slapped her back repeatedly, but it was to no avail. The delivery room was dead silent. The doctors and maids here were of course veterans with rich experience in delivering babies. They might not understand the scientific principle behind the crying of newborns, but there was one thing they were very clear about. A baby that did not cry was a dead baby. Colin stopped the doctor who was still slapping the baby mechanically and ordered, "You may leave." The doctors were relieved and hurriedly bowed and left, as if they were afraid that Colin would suddenly change his mind. Aisha had already fainted, but that was only because she did not have enough energy. Her life was not in danger. What Colin was really worried about was his newborn daughter. Although he had already made the decision to save the mother when he ordered the doctors to perform a cesarean section, he also realized that it would be difficult for his daughter to survive if she were to suddenly leave her mother's body with an unstable bloodline. However, when he saw the wrinkled little life in front of him with his own eyes, the feeling of being connected by blood still made Colin's heart tremble, and he could not control himself. At this moment, there was only one thing in his mind: to save her at all costs. However, what surprised him was that his child with Aisha was not a blood kin. Therefore, Colin immediately thought that if he were to turn her into a blood kin now, would he be able to save her from this near-death state? However, what made Colin hesitate was that if he were to bite his daughter now, she would only become a blood thrall and not a blood kin. This was because Colin could only turn a knight into a blood kin. Obviously, this newborn baby girl was not a knight. Even if he immediately found a priest to baptize her, it would be too late. However, Colin only hesitated for a moment before lowering his head and biting. Even if this child became a blood thrall, it would be better than becoming a corpse. However, the development of the situation once again exceeded Colin's expectations. When he bit open a wound on his daughter's small neck and sucked some blood, he unexpectedly discovered that there was a suction force coming from his daughter's wound. Colin was overjoyed at this unexpected good news. This was because he knew that this was a unique process of the embrace ritual to transform a blood descendant. Transforming a blood thrall would not cause this kind of reverse suction. But the problem was that his daughter wasn't a knight. How could she trigger the conditions for the embrace? Could it be because of her special bloodline? Colin suddenly realized that perhaps the trigger for the embrace was not a profession, but a bloodline. Could it be that the bloodline of the knights was somehow similar to the phoenix bloodline of the high elves? While he was thinking, Colin's blood flowed into the baby girl's body through the fangs. Slowly, wisps of blood-red smoke floated out of their bodies. These wisps of smoke seemed to be alive, condensing into mysterious and profound patterns in the air. In his daze, waves of low and deep voices that sounded like sleep-talking reverberated in Colin's ears. Outside the half-elven palace, the battle was still going on. However, the blood cavalry had already gained the upper hand. They were reducing the space for the Silver Moon Guard to move. At the same time, they were trying to save the burning granary to prevent the fire from spreading. However, at this moment, A slim figure suddenly appeared in front of the palace gate. "Stop!" An officer of the blood cavalry rode forward and stopped the woman. Although the half-elf woman in front of him looked weak and posed no threat, the fact that she could pass through the chaotic Silver Moon City and come to the palace alone while facing the murderous blood cavalry showed that this half-elf woman was definitely not simple. "General, I'm the Grand Priestess of the Temple of Fate in the Silver Moon City. I want to see Count Angeli." Tricely took off the thin veil on her face and said in a clear voice. The officer did not know Tricely. Her beautiful face under the thin veil made him lose focus for a second. However, he quickly recovered and said in a cold tone, "Sorry, Grand Priestess?" "I'm sorry, Your Excellency High Priest. The Count has ordered that no one is allowed to enter the half-elf palace." Tricely did not give up after hearing the officer's words. She continued, "General, it's about the life of the Queen and her baby. Please make an exception." The officer frowned and hesitated for a second. He said, "Please wait for a second." After saying that, he rode back to the palace. After a while, the gate of the palace opened again. Knight Roger rode his horse to Tricely and questioned, "You said that the Queen and her baby are in danger?" Tricely said with certainty, "If I'm not wrong, the Queen should be having a difficult labor now." Knight Roger looked at the Grand Priestess in front of him and nodded, "All right, follow me." Tricely smiled and jumped onto a warhorse handed to her by a soldier. She followed Knight Loki and galloped into the depths of the palace. Just as they were about to reach the Queen's chamber, a loud cry of a baby suddenly sounded and spread through half of the palace. Hearing this sound, the courtiers, guards, and maids in the palace all shouted excitedly. A festive atmosphere immediately enveloped the entire palace. Only Tricely's expression changed greatly, as if she had seen something unbelievable. Knight Roger was also immersed in this intense joy, so he didn't notice that something was wrong with Tricely. By the time he turned around, Chui Silly had already put on a warm smile and congratulated him. "Your Majesty, congratulations on your successful delivery. Since that's the case, there's no need for me to disturb her." However, Knight Roger was keenly aware of the Grand Priestess's abnormality. He immediately smiled and said, "Grand Priestess, since you're already here, you should at least meet with the Queen and the Count. Please wait a moment, I'll go inform them." After saying that, Knight Roger ignored Tricely's urging and strode into the chamber. In the chamber, Aisha was also startled awake by the baby girl's cries. She struggled to get up and weakly called out, "Colin, where's our child? Don't worry, she's here." Colin gently picked up his daughter and placed her in Aisha's arms. Aisha took the baby girl who was still crying. Her face was instantly filled with tears of joy. Seeing this heartwarming scene, Colin's heart was filled with warmth. At this moment, he felt that his connection with this world had increased by another layer. There was one more person in this world that was worthy of his protection. However, this heartwarming moment was interrupted by a series of footsteps. "Sir, there's a Grand Priestess of the Temple of Fate outside requesting an audience." Knight Roger loudly reported through the curtain. Colin replied without turning his head. At this moment, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to some Grand Priestess. Knight Roger did not leave and instead spoke again. "Sir, this Grand Priestess once said that the Queen's labor would be dangerous." Colin's interest was piqued. At the same time, he also thought that the Grand Priestess of the Goddess of Fate might be related to that Phoenix projection. Perhaps, Aisha's difficult labor crisis was caused by this guy, which was why she appeared in the palace so coincidentally. But why did she walk right into the trap? Thinking of this, Colin narrowed his eyes. A dangerous glint could be seen in his eyes. "She's still outside?" "Yes, she seemed to want to retreat after hearing the baby's cries, but I didn't let her leave." "Very good." Colin kissed Aisha's and his daughter's foreheads and gently said, "You two have a good rest. I'm going to settle the score with a certain someone." Aisha lightly nodded and said, "Itchem, but you have to be careful. This Grand Priestess Tricely's background is mysterious. She might not be easy to deal with." Colin stood up and coldly said, "Don't worry, no matter who did this, they will pay the price." Chapter 386. In the guest hall, Colin quietly looked at the high priestess of the goddess of destiny in front of him, his eyes flashing. She was a rather beautiful half-elf. She had emerald green hair, amber eyes, and exquisite facial features. She was like a classical sculpture in a palace that had come to life. Her temperament was cold and elegant, but she also revealed a natural and unpretentious charm. However, Colin was not in the mood to admire a beauty at this moment. He sized up Tricely with an undisguised scrutinizing gaze, and did not respond to her congratulatory words. He asked stiffly, "How did you know that Her Majesty would have a difficult birth?" Faced with Colin's questioning, Tricely smiled gently and said calmly, "Because the reason for Her Majesty's difficult birth is actually related to me." Colin immediately narrowed his eyes. He did not expect this high priestess to be so frank. "Oh, how is it related?" "Earl, you should have seen the phantom of the phoenix that appeared in the sky above Silver Moon City last night, right?" "I saw it." "What was that?" "That was the projection of the remnant soul of the phoenix in the world." Seeing Colin's confused expression, Tricely continued to explain, "Legend has it that before the age of the dragons, phoenixes were the rulers of this world. However, due to some unknown reasons, they have disappeared for tens of thousands of years. However, their bloodline has not been completely cut off, because the elves are said to have inherited the phoenix bloodline. The elves are extremely respectful of the phoenix bloodline. The more concentrated the phoenix bloodline, the higher their status. In order to maintain the purity of the phoenix bloodline, the elves with a high concentration of the phoenix bloodline are no longer willing to marry the elves with a low concentration of the phoenix bloodline. They even gradually evolved into a separate branch of the race, the High Elves. Among the High Elves, the ones with the highest concentration of the phoenix bloodline are the royals. Their most distinctive features are their fiery red pupils and hair. Hearing this, Colin's expression changed. This was because his newborn daughter had fiery red pupils. As for her hair, although it was sparse, it was also fiery red. It seemed that his daughter did indeed have a high concentration of the phoenix bloodline that only the High Elves royals would have. However, Aisha was a half-elf with a lowly bloodline, so it was obviously impossible for her to give birth to such a baby girl naturally. Someone must have done something. Colin suppressed his emotions and continued listening to Tricely's story. With the passage of time, the bloodline of the High Elves will inevitably become thinner with each generation, to the point where you won't find a single red-eyed, red-haired descendant in the entire royal family. In order to purify the bloodline of their descendants, the High Elves created a ritual called blood blessing. This ritual required the consumption of a precious meteorite called the Phoenix Soul Stone Fragment, which had a certain probability of improving the bloodline of an unborn child. It could even allow ordinary elves to give birth to the red-eyed and red-haired phoenix bloodline that only the noblest High Elf royalty could possess. However, the Phoenix Soul Stone that falls from the sky is too rare, and only one will fall every few hundred years. That's why the royal family of the High Elves inevitably declined even with this secret ritual to improve their bloodline. In the end, they couldn't even find a descendant who could become the Phoenix King. Colin wasn't interested in the decline of the High Elves, so he couldn't help but interrupt. "So, the Phoenix Phantom that appeared in the sky above Silver Moon City last night was someone casting the blessing of blood, in an attempt to raise the bloodline of Her Majesty's fetus?" "Yes." "Then who was the one who performed this ritual?" "It's me." Tricely admitted it openly, without any hesitation. Colin snorted and laughed coldly. "Tricely, you don't think that I'll thank you for this, do you?" "Of course not." Tricely shook her head lightly and said indifferently, "As a half-elf, Her Majesty is unable to give birth to a High Elf royalty. This ritual seems to be raising the fetus's bloodline, but in reality, it will take the lives of the mother and daughter. So, I'm very curious, how did Her Majesty give birth so smoothly?" Colin obviously wouldn't tell Tricely how he saved Aisha and her daughter. He stared coldly into her eyes and said angrily, "So, you admit that you tried to murder Her Majesty?" "Yes." Marquis Vincent of the Eastern region found me and promised that as long as I helped him perform this ritual and successfully caused an accident in Queen Aisha's labor, he would let the Temple of Destiny control the faith of the half-elf kingdom. Cullen wasn't too surprised by this answer. Whether it was the reappearance of his old rival, Marquis Vincent, or the betrayal of the Temple of Destiny, it was all within reason. What he really couldn't understand was the actions of this high priest. If that's the case, why are you appearing in front of me again? Do you really think that I don't dare to kill you? Count, the reason why I'm here is to make up for my mistakes. Ha! Colin interrupted with a cold smile. You're not going to tell me that you've just performed the ritual and put Elsa and her mother in extreme danger, and then you've suddenly found your conscience and come to the palace in person to save them? In the face of Colin's doubts, Tricely still answered calmly. Yes, Count. Maybe it's hard for you to believe, but in fact, when I found out that my ritual was successful, the first thing I thought of was to save Her Majesty and the child in her belly. Do you know why? Colin sneered. Why? Because I found that the blessing of blood ritual was more successful than I thought. Tricely looked at Colin with bright eyes. If I'm not wrong, Her Majesty's baby girl should have red eyes and red hair, right? Seeing Colin nodding, Tricely's pious expression became more and more intense. Yes, Count. I originally wanted to cooperate with the Eastern region to murder Her Majesty the Queen, but I thought that the fetus in Her Majesty's womb would at most have the blood of an ordinary high elf. I didn't expect it to be the most noble and rare high elf royal blood. This must be the blessing of the goddess of destiny. The high elf royal blood has reappeared in the world. How can such a miracle be compared with what the Eastern region promised? That's why I came to the palace without hesitation to help Her Majesty give birth. After listening to Tricely's explanation, Colin didn't speak anymore. Instead, he rubbed his chin as if he was considering whether her words were credible. Tricely saw this and spoke again. Count, I know it's hard for you to believe my words alone. So, I've prepared a gift for you. What gift? Marquis Vincent of the Eastern region is still in the Temple of Destiny. If you believe me, please send an elite team to follow me back. We'll definitely catch him. Only then did Colin reveal a satisfied smile and clap his hands. A figure shrouded in armor silently appeared in the living room. Tricely glanced at the armored man curiously before reminding Colin, My lord, Marquis Vincent's guards are extraordinary when he came to Silvery Moon City this time. There's even a rank 5 knight among them. Colin interrupted indifferently, You just take my people to find Vincent. You don't have to worry about what happens next. Seeing the confident look on Colin's face, Tricely was relieved. She immediately bowed and then turned to leave. The armored man immediately followed her silently. Chapter 387. The curtains blocked out the sunlight, and the smell of amber and roses filled the bedroom with a tranquil atmosphere. Colin walked in quietly and found that Aisha and his daughter had already fallen asleep. He hurriedly held his breath and slowed down his heartbeat, afraid that he would wake up the two sleeping beauties in front of him. Kneeling by the bed, Colin stared motionlessly at the pink little fellow in Aisha's arms. She had long, pointed ears like Aisha's, and single eyelids like Colin's. However, her sparse hair was different from the two of them. It was a fiery red. Round little face, chubby little hands and feet, and dense curly eyelashes. In Colin's eyes, this delicate little fellow was simply the creator's greatest masterpiece. He looked at her without blinking, as if he was looking at a miracle, a treasure, a gift. That's my daughter. Colin sighed silently, and he couldn't help but reach out to gently touch the little fellow. The little fellow seemed to feel her father's touch. She hummed a few times, and her chubby little hands waved randomly before coincidentally grabbing onto Colin's fingers. Colin didn't dare to move, and he blamed himself for disturbing his daughter's sleep. Fortunately, the little fellow didn't wake up, and Colin secretly heaved a sigh of relief. However, this commotion woke up Queen Aisha. She opened her big blue eyes, and there was still fatigue in her gaze, but it was also brimming with unconcealable happiness. After seeing her lover, Aisha stretched her body lazily and revealed a warm smile. She asked in a low voice, "You're right. she asked softly, "have you finished dealing with that high priestess of the goddess of fate?" Colin didn't answer immediately, but first looked at his daughter. Seeing that the little fellow was still sleeping soundly, he lowered his voice and said, "Yes." Then, he recounted the situation of his meeting with High Priestess Trisalai to Aisha. Aisha listened quietly, pondered for a moment, and asked, "Do you believe what Trisalai said?" Colin shook his head and said without hesitation, "I don't believe you." Aisha immediately smiled. "Then why did you send someone to follow her to capture Marquis Vincent?" "I just want to see what kind of tricks she can play." Colin shrugged and said casually, "Moreover, this is also a form of surveillance to prevent the High Priest from escaping. Of course, if she really delivers Marquis Vincent to me, perhaps I can consider letting her live." Aisha nodded, agreeing with Colin's way of handling the matter. However, she was still a little puzzled as she asked, "Why do you think Chui Silly took the initiative to come to the palace?" Colin smiled coldly and said, "I'm guessing that Chui Silly originally thought that you wouldn't be able to successfully give birth to the child, so she felt that this was a good opportunity. Since she was able to enhance our daughter's bloodline through the ritual, she must have some kind of secret method to help you give birth. If she really helps you get through this, she will definitely gain our trust. This way, the Temple of Destiny will have an opportunity to be reborn." Aisha thought for a moment and said, "Then is it possible that Chui Silly originally planned to use the eastern region to swindle the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment from the House of St. Prospero? On the surface, it was to harm me, but in reality, it was to use my belly to give birth to a high elf royal bloodline?" Colin muttered, "It is possible, but is the high elf royal bloodline really that important to the Temple of Destiny? I can't be sure." However, the most credible guess as to why the elves suddenly disappeared was that there was a huge turmoil within their clan. In order to prevent outsiders from taking advantage of the chaos, they chose to seal off the Radiant Moon Forest and cut off contact with the outside world. The root of the chaos was because they lacked an elven king that was recognized by all of their clansmen. This caused the entire clan to fall apart, and the internal strife continued. So, if a high elf royal bloodline suddenly appeared at this time, maybe Chui Silly thought that it could end the chaos. Colin nodded, thinking that Aisha's guess was very reasonable. This might also be the reason why Chui Silly did not hesitate to betray Marquis Vincent when she found out that Aisha had successfully given birth. From the beginning, the High Priest of the Temple of Destiny did not really intend to rely on the eastern region. However, Colin always liked to be lenient with his enemies, so that he could prevent the worst from happening. "Let's wait for Chui Silly to help me catch Marquis Vincent." "Okay." Aisha nodded and asked, "How is the rebellion of the Silver Moon Guard?" "The Bloody Cavalry has basically controlled the situation. Most of the Silver Moon Guard have surrendered, and only a few people are still stubbornly resisting. However, they won't be able to jump around for long." Aisha was relieved and smiled. Then she stroked the sleeping baby's chest a few times and said, "Now, the most important thing is waiting for you, my love." Colin was stunned and did not react for a moment. "What?" Aisha giggled and said, "Let's give our daughter a name." Colin also smiled and muttered, "Miller will be her family's surname." As for her name, Aisha looked at Colin, who was thinking, gently raised her delicate hand, stroked his face, and said lazily, "You'd better think of a few more names. You must satisfy me." But Colin was a little distressed, but he was more eager to try. He stared at the sleeping baby, and the feeling of blood connection emerged again. All of a sudden, Colin had an epiphany. The baby in front of him was the first mark Colin left in this world. It was also the recognition of the world's origin to him, an outsider. A kind of wonderful blood surged in Colin's body. In an instant, his eyes turned into a deep red color. In a trance, Colin found that he seemed to be floating, passing through layers of palaces and flying above Silver Moon City. The warm sunlight surrounded him, and the gentle breeze supported his body. Above the boundless void, a deep gaze was cast over, as if it was from countless planes and eras. For a moment, Colin seemed to be inspired by something, and he could not help but speak. "Her name is Sylph, the incarnation of fire, the queen of elves." At this moment, the whole Silver Moon City heard this voice. Sylph? In the luxurious villa in the center of the business district, a group of half-elves who were nervous looked up at the same time and saw the shock and confusion in each other's eyes. Sylph. In a certain alley in Silvermoon City, Duke Modwin, who was still resisting with all his might, was suddenly stunned. However, at this moment he was shocked to find that the Silvermoon Guard who had fought with him until this moment had all put down their weapons. Sylph? In the Temple of Destiny, Marquis Vincent frowned and looked in the direction of the half-elven palace, his heart heavy. Sylph, the Queen of Elves. Outside the temple, High Priestess Tricely suddenly knelt on the ground and kowtowed, chanting, "You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.